The morning of March 1st, 2008, began with a paradox that the town of Emory, Texas, would never reconcile. A family home lay in smoldering ruins, a blackened skeleton of timber and ash. Inside, the bodies of a mother and her 2 young sons were cooling, bearing the brutal marks of gunfire and a heavy blade. The father, Terry Caffey, survived only by crawling through the darkness, leaving a trail of blood across the yard. The horror wasn't just the violence, it was the architect. 16-year-old Erin Caffey, the girl with the angelic voice who led the church choir, wasn't a victim of the fire. She was the hand that lit the match. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. The town of Emory, Texas, is a quiet, religious enclave where the landscape is defined by the dense, unyielding thickets of the East Texas piney woods, a region where the trees grow so close together they seem to swallow the light. In 2008, it was a place where life was measured by the seasons of the harvest and the Sunday morning service. Standing as a pillar of this community was the Caffey family. Terry and Penny Caffey had spent nearly 2 decades building a life that was meant to be a living testament to their faith. Their home, a 2-story wooden house known locally as the House on the Hill, sat at the end of a long, winding gravel driveway, perched above the town like a watchtower. It was a secluded sanctuary, surrounded by acres of private land, where the only sounds were the rustle of the wind through the pines and the occasional call of a hawk. Inside the walls of that home, the atmosphere was a carefully maintained blend of discipline and devotion. Terry was the family's anchor, a man of quiet, sturdy conviction who worked as a clinical supervisor at a nearby hospital. He was a provider who took his role as the spiritual head of the household with the utmost seriousness. His wife, Penny, was the vibrant heart of the family. A talented pianist and a woman of immense warmth, she had dedicated her life to the education and upbringing of their 3 children. She was the one who filled the house with music, teaching her children to play instruments and sing before they could even read. The Caffeys were more than just a family. They were a self-contained unit, a small, harmonious world governed by the principles of homeschooling and scripture. The eldest child, 16-year-old Erin Caffey, was the family's crowning achievement. With her porcelain skin, dark hair, and a voice that people in Emory described as pure liquid gold, she was the town's quintessential good girl. Erin didn't just sing in the choir at the Miracle Baptist Church. She led it, her soprano voice carrying hymns of praise with a clarity that seemed to transcend her teenage years. To the congregation, she was an angel in a sundress, a girl who appeared completely untouched by the cynicism of the outside world. Her parents were immensely proud of her, seeing her talent as a gift from God that required careful stewardship. They sheltered her, not out of a desire for control, but out of a deep-seated fear that the world beyond their hill would tarnish her light. The younger brothers, 13-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Tyler, rounded out the family portrait. Matthew was a soft-spoken boy who was beginning to find his own voice through the guitar, while Tyler was the family's high-energy spark, a child whose laughter often echoed through the hallways of the House on the Hill. The brothers adored their older sister, and the 3 of them were rarely seen apart. They were a trio of well-mannered, musical children who seemed to thrive in the isolation of their rural home. Their days were a rhythmic cycle of lessons, chores, and music practice, all overseen by Penny's encouraging guidance and Terry's protective gaze. But as Erin entered her 16th year, the silence of the hill began to feel less like peace and more like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The very isolation that Terry and Penny cherished was becoming a source of internal friction for their daughter. While her parents saw the thick woods as a barrier against the darkness of the world, Erin was beginning to see them as a cage. She had spent her entire life performing the role of the perfect daughter, smiling through every service and nodding through every lecture. But beneath the surface, a tectonic shift was occurring. She was growing restless, her mind wandering toward the life she saw other teenagers living, a life of autonomy, of secrets, and of choices that weren't vetted by a parent. The House on the Hill, for all its beauty and faith, was becoming a pressure cooker of unexpressed desires. Terry and Penny had created a world where there was no room for error, no space for the messy, complicated realities of growing up. They believed that by keeping the world at bay, they were keeping their children safe. They didn't realize that by denying Aaron the chance to experience the world, they were fueling a hunger for it that would eventually consume everything they had built. The angelic voice that filled the church every Sunday was beginning to crack, and the girl behind the music was starting to listen to a different, much darker melody. The stage was set, the house was quiet, and the family on the hill had no idea that the greatest threat to their sanctuary was already living inside its walls. The transformation of the cafe household began not with a violent outburst, but with the mundane hum of a summer job. It was the summer of 2007, and 16-year-old Erin had convinced her parents to let her work at the Sonic Drive-In in the neighboring town of Alba. Terry and Penny saw this as a healthy milestone, a way for their daughter to interact with the world under the safe umbrella of a paycheck and a steady schedule. They thought it would teach her responsibility. They didn't realize that the drive-in was a crossroads where the sheltered world of Emory met the gritty, unvarnished reality of East Texas. 18-year-old Charlie Wilkinson was a frequent presence at the Sonic, a young man who carried himself with a swagger that was entirely foreign to the boys Aaron knew from church. He was a high school dropout who lived in a cluttered mobile home and worked odd jobs, a person whose very existence was a rebellion against the structured, religious life the Caffeys had built. He was unrefined, his skin often stained with grease or dirt, and he spoke with a gravelly defiance that acted like a magnet for a girl who had spent 16 years under the soft, controlled glow of church lights. To the people of Emory, he was simply trouble, a boy who lacked direction and respect for authority. But to Aaron, Charlie was a revelation. He was the first person to look at her not as a choir leader or a daughter, but as a woman with her own dangerous potential. Their attraction was visceral and immediate, a fusion of teenage hormones and mutual isolation. As the Texas heat began to break into the fall of 2007, Aaron and Charlie's relationship moved from casual flirting over milkshakes to a clandestine obsession. Because Aaron was homeschooled and lived on a secluded hill, their communication was almost entirely digital. A series of hidden MySpace bulletins and late-night text messages sent from a phone her parents didn't know she possessed. In the virtual space of 2008, Aaron could be someone else. She could drop the angel persona and adopt the language of a girl who was ready to ride or die for her man. She began to view her life on the hill as an elaborate prison, and her parents as the jailers who were keeping her from her true destiny with Charlie. But in a small town like Emory, secrets have a way of bleeding through the cracks. Terry and Penny began to notice a change in the frequency of Aaron's voice, not the musical one she used at church, but her everyday tone, which had grown sharp, defensive, and cold. The girl who used to spend her evenings practicing piano or helping her mother with the boys was now retreating to her room for hours at a time, the blue light of a hidden screen illuminating a face that had grown unfamiliar. The friction reached a boiling point in early February when Terry discovered a cache of messages between his daughter and Wilkinson. The content was more than just typical teenage romance. It was a disturbing dive into a subculture of defiance that Terry couldn't ignore. He saw his daughter's soul being tugged away by a boy who represented every moral failing he had tried to protect her from. The confrontation took place in the kitchen of the house on the hill, a room that had always been the warm center of their family life. Terry and Penny delivered a decree that was intended to be a shield. The relationship with Charlie Wilkinson was over. He was no longer allowed on the property, and Aaron was forbidden from contacting him in any way. Terry, acting with the protective instinct of a father who sensed a predator, believed that by cutting the ties, he was saving his daughter from a path of ruin. He didn't see the flicker of something dark behind her eyes, a silent, hardening resolve that would eventually prove more dangerous than any boy from town. Aaron didn't scream. She didn't plead. She simply went to her room and began the work of a double agent. She used a friend's phone to reach out to Charlie, telling him that her parents were monsters who were trying to destroy their love. She painted a picture of a household that was a psychological prison, framing herself as a captive who could only be freed through a drastic, violent intervention. Charlie, who possessed a warped sense of chivalry and a volatile temper, took the bait. He saw himself as the hero of a twisted fairy tale, the one who would storm the castle and rescue the princess from her captors. To execute a plan of this magnitude, Charlie recruited reinforcements from his own circle of outcasts. Charles Wade, a 20-year-old who lived in a shed behind Charlie's trailer, was a man with a fragile ego and a penchant for weapons. He often boasted of being a ninja, carrying a collection of swords and knives as if they were symbols of a power he lacked in reality. Wade's girlfriend, Bobby Johnson, was also brought into the fold, a young woman who seemed to follow the group's lead with a chilling level of passivity. Together, the four of them began meeting in the cramped, smoke-filled trailer, the air thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and the vibration of heavy metal music that drowned out the quiet sounds of the East Texas night. It was here, in the shadows of the trailer park, that the Angel of Emory laid out the logistics of her own family's demise. Erin provided the floor plans of the house on the hill, detailing exactly where her brothers, Matthew and Tyler, would be sleeping. She discussed the layout of her parents' master bedroom and the best way to enter the house without alerting the dogs or making the floorboards groan. The plot wasn't just a fantasy of rebellion, it was becoming a tactical operation. Erin insisted that there could be no witnesses, that her parents and her brothers had to be eliminated to ensure that she and Charlie could run away together without anyone following them. She even suggested that the house be burned down to erase the evidence of their presence. The group spent the final days of February gathering their tools. A .22 caliber pistol was secured, and Wade spent hours sharpening a samurai-style sword, the metallic rasp of the stone against the blade, a rhythmic precursor to the violence to come. Erin continued to play her part at home, sitting at the dinner table with the people she had marked for death, her voice still clear and beautiful during church services. The juxtaposition was absolute, a girl singing of grace while orchestrating a massacre. The psychological state of her younger brothers during those final days adds a layer of quiet tragedy to the narrative. Matthew, at 13, had begun to sense the distance in his sister, a growing rift that he couldn't quite put into words. He looked up to Erin, seeing her as the golden standard of the family, and the way she had suddenly pulled away left him in a state of confusion. Tyler, only 8, remained blissfully unaware, his world still defined by the simple joys of the hill. They were innocent bystanders in a war they didn't know was being waged, their safety entirely dependent on the very sister who was currently counting the bullets in a trailer across town. By the night of February 29th, the tension in the conspiracy was at a fever pitch. Charlie and Wade were fueled by a sense of dark purpose, while Erin remained the cool, detached center of the storm. She had convinced herself that her family was merely a set of obstacles, that the blood of her brothers was a small price to pay for the freedom she believed she deserved. As the sun set on the final day of February, the house on the hill was bathed in a deceptive peace, the tall pines casting long, skeletal shadows across the driveway. The Cafes went to bed that night, thinking their daughter was safe in her room, unaware that she was waiting for the sound of a gravel-muffled engine at the bottom of the hill. The clock in the kitchen of the house on the hill ticked toward 3 a.m., marking the final moments of the world as the Cafes knew it. Outside, the East Texas night was a wall of absolute black, the humidity clinging to the pine needles like a damp shroud. At the base of the long, winding driveway, a silver sedan rolled to a stop, its headlights extinguished to avoid piercing the canopy of trees. Inside the cramped cabin, the air was thick with the scent of cheap cigarettes and the sharp, metallic tang of nervous sweat. Erin sat in the back seat, her face a pale mask in the darkness. She told Charlie and Wade that the time had come, her voice devoid of the tremor one might expect from a daughter about to witness the erasure of her own bloodline. She didn't get out of the car. Instead, she remained in the shadows with Bobby Johnson, a silent witness to the departure of the two men who carried the instruments of her liberation. Charlie Wilkinson stepped into the cool air, adjusting the .22 caliber pistol tucked into his waistband, while Charles Wade gripped the hilt of the sharpened sword he had boasted about for weeks. They moved up the gravel path with a practiced, predatory silence, their boots crunching softly on the stones. Erin had assured them that the back door would be unlocked, or that a window would provide easy access. She had essentially handed them the keys to her family's life, promising them that inside, they would find a stash of cash, thousands of dollars that would fund their new life together. The men reached the porch. The wood groaned slightly under their weight, a sound that would usually alert the protective Terry Caffey. But the house remained still. They entered through the back, the smell of Penny's lavender laundry detergent and the remnants of a home-cooked dinner greeting them, a stark domestic contrast to the violence they were about to unleash. They moved through the kitchen, past the table where the family had prayed just hours before, and toward the master bedroom on the first floor. Terry and Penny were deep in the heavy, restorative sleep of people who believed their world was secure. The first sign of the nightmare was the sudden, violent intrusion of light and motion. Charlie entered the room first. He didn't hesitate. He leveled the pistol at the bed and pulled the trigger. The sharp crack, crack, crack of the small caliber rounds shattered the silence. Terry was hit multiple times in the face, the neck, the shoulder. He felt the impact not as pain, but as a series of hot, jarring electrical shocks that threw his body into a state of immediate, blinding confusion. Penny woke to the sound of her husband's muffled cries and the flashes of gunfire. Before she could process the image of the boy standing in her doorway, the blade arrived. Charles Wade stepped forward, the sword catching the faint light filtering through the window. He began a frantic, amateurish assault, the heavy steel biting into Penny's flesh. She fought with the desperation of a mother, her hands reaching out to shield herself, but the blade was relentless. Terry, drifting in and out of consciousness, could hear the wet, heavy sounds of the struggle next to him. He was paralyzed, his jaw shattered, his lungs beginning to fill with blood. Yet he was forced to endure the auditory landscape of his wife's final moments. The attackers, believing they had finished their work in the master bedroom, turned their attention toward the stairs. Upstairs, the world of childhood innocence was being violently dismantled. 13-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Tyler had been awakened by the noise below, the sharp pops of the pistol and the thuds of the struggle. They were terrified, huddling in the darkness of the hallway. Wade and Wilkinson ascended the stairs with the frantic energy of men who had already crossed a line and were now racing to erase the consequences. They found the boys near the landing. The violence that followed was of a different, more intimate order. The .22 pistol jammed or ran out of ammunition, leaving the sword as the primary tool of execution. Matthew tried to protect his younger brother, his small frame no match for the two older men, fueled by adrenaline and a warped sense of mission. The blade was used with a lack of precision that only increased the horror. The boys were cornered in their bedroom, surrounded by the posters and toys that defined their short lives. They pleaded for their lives, their voices high and thin, reaching out for the sister who was sitting in a car just a few hundred yards away, listening to the quiet rustle of the pines. Wade later described the scene with a chilling detachment, noting how the younger boy, Tyler, had tried to hide. It didn't matter. The directive from Aaron had been absolute. No witnesses. The men carried out the orders with a systematic brutality that left the upstairs hallway painted in the visceral reality of their deeds. Once the screaming stopped, the silence that returned to the house on the hill was heavy and unnatural. The killers didn't leave immediately. They began to ransack the house, looking for the thousands of dollars Aaron had promised them. They tore through drawers and tossed Penny's jewelry aside, looking for the massive cache of cash they believed was hidden within the walls. They found only a few $100s, a pittance for the souls they had just taken. The realization that the treasure was a fabrication didn't slow them down. They had one final task to perform. The ransacking was not the professional search of a thief, but the frantic, destructive energy of a child playing at being a criminal. Wade overturned the piano bench where Penny had spent so many hours teaching hymns. He kicked through the guitar cases and the school books, his heavy boots crushing the physical remnants of the boys' education. Every drawer they emptied and every closet they tossed revealed nothing but the humble, modest lives of a family that valued faith over finance. The treasure was a mirage, yet they continued to dig, their hands growing slick with the residue of their crimes. They moved back through the house, pouring lighter fluid and other accelerants over the furniture, the bedding, and the bodies. Charlie found a container of lighter fluid in the pantry, the plastic bottle feeling small and inadequate for the task. He began to squeeze it over the surfaces of the kitchen, the clear liquid soaking into the wooden table and the linoleum floor. The smell was sharp and chemical, cutting through the heavy metallic scent of the shootings. He moved toward the living room, trailing the fluid behind him like a dark, invisible thread. Wade followed, using a lighter he had carried for years, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls that were already stained with the family's blood. When the first match was dropped onto the bedding in the master bedroom, the response was instantaneous. The fabric caught with a soft whoosh, the orange glow illuminating the faces of the two men as they stood for a single, frozen second, watching the destruction begin. Wade and Wilkinson exited the house, the orange glow of the growing fire reflecting in the windows. They walked back down the long driveway, their clothes stained, their breathing ragged. When they reached the car, Erin looked up. She didn't ask if her mother was okay. She didn't ask about her brothers. She only wanted to know if it was done, if the obstacles to her happiness had been removed. Charlie confirmed the success of the mission. The car's engine turned over, the tires spitting gravel as they sped away from the hill, leaving the house to be consumed by the flames. Behind them, the house on the hill became a funeral pyre. The ancient timbers, dried by years of Texas sun, burned with a terrifying efficiency. The smoke rose into the air, a dark pillar that should have signaled to the town of Emory that something was wrong. But the isolation of the property worked in the killer's favor. The neighbors were miles away, and the woods acted as a muffler, keeping the secret of the burning house for a few more precious hours. Inside the inferno, Terry Caffey was experiencing a miracle born of sheer, agonizing willpower. The heat of the flames acted as a cauterizing agent for some of his wounds, and the sheer instinct to survive overrode the trauma of his injuries. He realized that if he didn't move, he would be cremated alongside his family. He began the impossible journey, dragging his broken body across the floor, through the thick, black smoke that threatened to suffocate him. Every inch was a battle against gravity and the urge to simply give up. He reached the window, the glass shattering as he fell through it and onto the cold, damp grass below. He lay there for a moment, the roar of the fire behind him sounding like a freight train. He could see the skeletal remains of his home through the smoke, the place where his wife and sons were still trapped. He knew they were gone. He had heard the silence that followed the violence. With a hole in his cheek and bullets in his spine, Terry Caffey began to crawl. He didn't head for the road. He headed through the woods toward the nearest neighbor's house, nearly a mile away. His path was marked by the blood he left on the leaves and the guttural, broken sounds of a man who had lost everything but his life. The night air was freezing, and shock was beginning to set in. He moved like an animal, on hands and knees, driven by a singular thought. Someone had to know. Someone had to find out what had happened on the hill. The pine needles scratched at his open wounds, and the darkness threatened to swallow him, but he kept moving. He was a ghost in the making, a living testament to a crime so heinous it defied the logic of the very town that had raised the girl who planned it. As the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, the house on the hill collapsed in a shower of sparks and ash, and Terry Caffey finally reached a porch, his bloody hand reaching up to knock on a door that would open to a new, unrecognizable world. Terry Caffey didn't fall from the window so much as he was expelled by the heat, a broken man hitting the damp Texas earth with a sickening thud. The shock of the cold ground against his charred skin was the only thing keeping him from drifting into the permanent dark. He lay there for a heartbeat, listening to the roar of his life's work being unmade. Above him, the house on the hill was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hungry, orange beast devouring the memories of his children's laughter and his wife's music. He tried to scream for Penny, but his jaw hung uselessly, shattered by a .22 caliber round, and his lungs could only produce a wet, bubbling wheeze. The crawl began not with a plan, but with a primal rejection of death. Terry pushed himself forward, his fingers digging into the pine needles and the red clay of the East Texas soil. Every inch was a betrayal of his anatomy. He had 3 bullets in his back, 1 in his leg, and a hole in his face where his smile used to be. He moved like a wounded animal, dragging his paralyzed lower half through the thickets. The woods were a labyrinth of thorns and shadows. The very trees his family had played among now seemed to conspire against him, snagging his clothes and tearing at his open wounds. He was a supervisor at a hospital. He knew the biological reality of his condition. He was bleeding out. His blood pressure was dropping. According to the logic of medicine, he should have stayed down, but he wasn't a doctor in that moment. He was a father. The distance to the nearest neighbor, the Whites, was nearly a mile through the dense, unlit forest. In the pitch black of 4 a.m., Terry navigated by the silhouette of the trees against the stars. He drifted into delirium, seeing flashes of Penny at the piano, her fingers dancing over the keys. The sound of the boys arguing over a video game. These memories were the fuel. He told himself he had to reach the road. He had to tell someone that the world was on fire. When he finally reached the Whites' porch, he was less a man and more a specter of gore. He dragged himself up the wooden steps, his fingernails clawing at the boards. He couldn't knock, not with a closed fist, so he slapped his bloody palm against the door, leaving a series of rhythmic, crimson smears. Inside, the neighbors were jolted awake by the sound of something heavy and wet striking their home. When they opened the door, they didn't see a neighbor. They saw a nightmare. Terry was covered in ash and blood, his eyes wide and pleading, his mouth a ruined cavern of bone and torn tissue. Through the wet rattle of his breath, he told them his house was gone and his family was inside. The first responders who raced toward the cafe property saw the glow long before they reached the driveway. The house on the hill was a skeletal ruin, a jagged silhouette of blackened beams against the pre-dawn sky. The heat was still so intense that it singed the leaves of the surrounding oaks. Firefighters moved in with hoses, but they knew they weren't there to save a home. They were there to recover what the fire hadn't finished. As the smoke began to clear and the sun began its indifferent climb over the horizon, the true scale of the massacre emerged from the rubble. The master bedroom was a blackened vault. Among the springs of a melted mattress, they found the remains of Penny Caffey. The forensic reality was as brutal as the act itself. She had been shot and nearly decapitated by a blade before the flames ever touched her. The investigators, men who had seen the worst that East Texas had to offer, were forced to turn away. But the horror intensified as they moved toward the remains of the second floor. In the area that had been the boys' bedroom, they found 13-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Tyler. They hadn't died in their sleep. The evidence suggested a frantic, failed attempt at survival. The boys were found huddled together, their small frames bearing the marks of a violence that no fire could mask. They had been hacked with a heavy edge, a blade that had been swung with such amateurish, frantic force that it had left deep gouges in the very floorboards beneath them. The silence that fell over the property was absolute, broken only by the hiss of water hitting hot embers. There was no music on the hill that morning. There was only the clinical, sterile movement of police tape being unspooled and the sound of cameras clicking to document the end of a family. The investigators looked for signs of a break-in, for a motive that made sense. A robbery gone wrong, a vengeful drifter. They saw the overturned furniture and the missing valuables. But as they stood in the ruins, one question began to circulate through the radio chatter. Where was the daughter? Erin's room was empty. Her body wasn't among the ruins. To the initial search teams, this was a second tragedy, a kidnapping. They assumed the angel of the family had been snatched by the monsters who had slaughtered her kin. They began to organize a search party, envisioning a terrified 16-year-old girl being held captive in the woods. They didn't yet realize that while they were mourning her, she was miles away, sleeping soundly in a mobile home, the smell of smoke still clinging to her hair. The miracle of Terry's survival was now eclipsed by a growing, sickening realization. As the detectives gathered at the hospital to speak with the man who had crawled through the woods, they expected him to name a stranger. Instead, through the wires and tubes and the reconstruction of his jaw, Terry Caffey would provide the first breadcrumbs of a betrayal so deep it would make the fire seem cold by comparison. The father was alive, but the world he had spent 20 years building had been replaced by a landscape of ash, and the impossible suspicion that the predator he feared was the one he had tucked into bed every night. As the smoke still curled from the blackened foundation of the cafe home, the Rains County Sheriff's Department shifted from fire recovery to an all-points bulletin for 16-year-old Erin. The initial working theory was simple and terrifying. A family had been slaughtered and their home torched, and the only person missing was a young, beautiful girl. In the minds of the investigators, Aaron was a hostage, a prize taken by the monsters who had wielded the blade and the gun. They envisioned a frantic rescue mission, picturing her tied up in a cellar or abandoned in the dense brush of the piney woods. The search led them quickly to the name that had been a source of tension in the cafe house for months: Charlie Wilkinson. A deputy was dispatched to the trailer park where Charlie lived, a starkly different world from the manicured hill Aaron had grown up on. When the police arrived at the cramped, rusted mobile home, they didn't find a scene of chaotic flight. Instead, they found a quiet, almost domestic tableau. Charlie was there, appearing relatively calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something jagged. And then there was Aaron. She wasn't bound. She wasn't bruised. She was sitting in the trailer, appearing to be in a state of profound shock. To the officers who first laid eyes on her, she looked like a survivor who had just crawled out of the wreckage of her own soul. She told them she had been kidnapped, that men had burst into her home and dragged her away while her family was being murdered. She spoke of the horror in a fragile, distant voice that immediately pulled at the heartstrings of the seasoned lawmen. They wrapped her in a blanket and escorted her to the station, treating her with the delicate care reserved for the broken. But back at the hospital, the narrative was being rewritten by a man who couldn't yet speak. Terry Caffey was being stabilized, his body a map of trauma, but his mind was crystal clear. Through the fog of surgery and heavy sedation, he communicated with the detectives using a pad of paper and a pen. His hand shook, the ink scratching across the page in jagged, desperate lines. He didn't just name Charlie Wilkinson as the man in his bedroom. He mentioned the presence of others. Most chillingly, he raised questions about the timing of the attack and the lack of a struggle from his daughter. Terry loved Aaron with a fierce, protective devotion, but the reality of the night was a cold weight he couldn't ignore. He remembered the silence from her room. He remembered that the dogs, who barked at every delivery truck, had been strangely quiet. The investigation began to pivot with a sudden, violent momentum. At the sheriff's office, the victim and her rescuers were being held in separate rooms. The detectives, now armed with Terry's account and the suspicious circumstances of finding Aaron at Charlie's residence, began to tighten the screws on the two young men, Charles Wade and Charlie Wilkinson. Wade, the self-styled ninja who had lived in a shed, was the first to fracture. He lacked the hardened resolve of a career criminal. He was a boy who had played with swords and now found himself facing the lethal injection. Under the fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, his bravado evaporated. Wade began to talk, and as he did, the angelic image of Aaron Caffey was stripped away, layer by layer. He described the meetings in the trailer, the way they had sat in a circle, fueled by resentment and cheap tobacco, while Aaron directed the symphony of violence. He told the investigators that it wasn't just Charlie's idea, it was hers. She was the one who had insisted that her brothers had to die. She was the one who had promised them a fortune hidden in her parents' bedroom. Most damningly, Wade revealed that while the killing was happening, Aaron was waiting in the car, less than 100 yards away, calmly monitoring the progress of her family's execution. As Wade spoke, Charlie Wilkinson also began to break. He realized that the ride or die pact was a fantasy. He confessed to the shooting, his voice trembling as he recounted the flashes of the .22 in the master bedroom, but he consistently returned to the same point. Aaron had pushed him. She had told him that her father was a monster, that she was being abused, claims that the investigation would later prove to be entirely fabricated. She had weaponized his volatility and his warped sense of chivalry to turn him into a heat-seeking missile aimed at her own front door. The search for physical evidence soon yielded the instruments of the massacre. Guided by the confessions, divers and search teams moved toward a nearby creek and a dense patch of woods. They recovered the .22 caliber pistol, its barrel still fouled with the residue of the night. But the most visceral discovery was the sword. It was a heavy, curved blade, its edge dulled by the resistance of bone and wood. When the forensic teams analyzed the weapon, they found more than just the family's blood. They found a direct link to Charles Wade. The clothing the men had worn was also recovered, burnt remnants and blood-soaked fabric that had been discarded in a desperate attempt to erase the night. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the detectives returned to Erin. The mask of the grieving daughter was still in place, but it was starting to slip. When confronted with the statements of her boyfriend and his accomplice, her demeanor shifted from fragile to icy. She didn't break down in tears of guilt. She became defensive, her voice losing its melodic quality and turning sharp and clinical. She tried to maintain the kidnapping story, but the digital trail was undeniable. The hidden cell phone, the MySpace messages, and the testimony of Bobby Johnson, who had watched Erin sit in the car while her house burned, created a cage of evidence that she couldn't sing her way out of. By the end of the first 48 hours, the Angel of Emory was no longer a victim. She was being processed into the Rains County Jail, charged with 3 counts of capital murder. The news rippled through the town like a tidal wave. People who had watched her lead the choir just days before were forced to reconcile the girl in the sundress with the girl who had ordered the slaughter of a child. The investigation had moved with lightning speed, transforming a tragedy of monsters in the woods into a much more terrifying reality. The monster was a 16-year-old girl with a beautiful voice and a heart of absolute stone. The legal reckoning was swift, yet it could never truly balance the scales for the 3 lives extinguished on the hill. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade, facing the looming shadow of the death penalty, traded their silence for life sentences without the possibility of parole, trading the open Texas sky for a permanent, cramped existence behind steel bars. They will live out their days in a concrete exile, the memory of that night their only companion. Bobby Johnson, the quiet passenger to a massacre, was handed 40 years for her complicity. Then came Erin's turn. The court looked past the angelic soprano and saw the cold, calculating mind of a killer. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 25 years, a punishment that ensured she would be an elderly woman before she ever tasted the air of a world she had scorched. The true resolution, however, occurred far from the gavel, in the quiet visiting room of a Texas prison. Terry Caffey, the man who had crawled through the woods with a shattered jaw, defied every expectation of a grieving survivor. He didn't seek vengeance. He sought the daughter who had tried to erase him. In a move that polarized the community of Emory, Terry publicly forgave Erin. He told the world that his faith required him to let go of the hate that threatened to consume him, though the scars on his face remained a permanent map of that night. He continues to visit her, the sole guardian of a family legacy that consists of 1 survivor and 3 graves. He remains a living paradox, a father who still loves the architect of his own destruction. Today, the hill in Emory remains silent, the charred ruins of the cafe home long ago overtaken by the creeping vines of the East Texas brush. It stands as a permanent monument to a peace that was shattered by one of its own, a place where church hymns were replaced by the hollow whistle of the wind. We are left to wonder how a heart so young could harbor a darkness so absolute. Erin Caffey remains a ghost behind glass, a haunting reminder that even the most angelic voices can sing the deadliest of secrets. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. The administrative staff at Mount Union University expected a routine conversation about enrollment. Instead, they became the unwilling audience to a massacre. On the other end of an open phone line, the rhythmic thud of an iron skillet and the desperate screams of a mother echoed through the digital void. Brenda Powell was a woman who had spent her career dedicated to saving children, but in that kitchen in Akron, Ohio, she couldn't save herself from her own daughter. As the line remained active, the golden child of the Powell family, Sydney, wasn't just ending a life. She was executing a secret that had finally and violently run out of time. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. The neighborhood on Scarsdale Drive in Akron, Ohio, was the kind of place where the silence felt intentional. A carefully maintained suburban piece where the lawns were edged with mathematical precision and the porch lights never flickered. In the center of this quietude stood the Powell household, a family that to any passerby represented the pinnacle of the American middle-class dream. At the heart of this home was Brenda Powell, a woman whose reputation in the community wasn't just good, it was nearly sacred. Brenda had spent 28 years as a child life specialist at Akron Children's Hospital. In the clinical, often sterile world of pediatric medicine, she was the warmth. Her job was to stand in the gap between terrified children and the daunting reality of their illnesses. She was the one who explained surgeries using dolls, the one who held the hands of parents as they received news that would shatter their worlds. She was an expert in empathy, a woman who had professionalized the act of caring. Friends and colleagues later remarked that she possessed a preternatural ability to calm the storm, making her a pillar of the hospital and the undisputed anchor of her own family. Stephen and Brenda Powell had built a life centered on their children, and Sydney, their eldest, was the shining star of that narrative. Growing up in the suburban sprawl of Northeast Ohio, Sydney was the quintessential golden child. In high school, she wasn't just a student, she was an achiever. She was the girl who balanced a demanding social life with the high expectations of a family that valued education above almost everything else. There was an unspoken pressure that permeated the halls of the Powell home, the kind of pressure that doesn't require shouting to be felt. It was a standard of excellence that Sydney seemed to embrace with a smile. When she graduated and headed to Mount Union University, a private institution about 40 miles southeast of Akron, it felt like the natural next step in a preordained journey. Sydney jumped into the college experience with the same vigor she had shown in high school. She joined the Alpha Chi Omega sorority, surrounding herself with a sisterhood that mirrored the high-achieving environment of her upbringing. She was social, she was active, and to her parents back on Scarsdale Drive, she was thriving. But the transition from the structured environment of a suburban high school to the autonomy of university life is where the first invisible fractures began to form. Mount Union is a beautiful campus, all brick and ivy and quiet study nooks. But for Sydney, those nooks became places of isolation rather than academic growth. The details of exactly when the slide began are murky, but the results were definitive. The girl who had always found a way to meet the mark suddenly found herself staring at a mounting pile of failures. By the end of 2019, the situation had moved from concerning to catastrophic. Sydney wasn't just struggling, she was drowning. The university's academic standards were clear, and Sydney had fallen far below the threshold. In December of that year, while the rest of the world prepared for the holidays, Sydney Powell was officially dismissed from Mount Union University for poor academic performance. This is the moment where the biography of a student turns into the psychology of a defendant. Most people, when faced with such a failure, would eventually break. They would tell their parents, endure the disappointment, and find a path toward redemption. But for Sydney, the golden child identity was a prison she couldn't escape. The thought of looking into Brenda's eyes, the woman who spent her days saving children, and telling her that she had flunked out was, in Sydney's mind, a fate worse than any lie. So she chose the lie. For the first few months of 2020, Sydney Powell lived a double life that required a staggering level of commitment. Every morning, she would dress for class. She would pack her bag, kiss her parents goodbye, and drive away from the house on Scarsdale Drive. But she wasn't driving toward a future. She was driving to local parking lots, to coffee shops, to any place where she could sit in her car and watch the hours of the school day tick by. She spent her days in a state of hyper-vigilant performance, maintaining a digital trail of busyness for her friends and family. She continued to pay her sorority dues. She attended campus events. She spoke to Brenda about upcoming exams and the stress of her coursework, all while knowing that she no longer had a seat in a single classroom. The pressure of this deception was immense, a weight that grew heavier with every sunset. Every time she returned home and sat across from her mother at the dinner table, the lie sat between them like a physical object. As the spring semester progressed, the university's administrative machinery continued to turn. Letters were sent, emails were dispatched, and phone calls were made. Sydney intercepted as much as she could. But in the age of digital connectivity and parental portals, a secret of this magnitude has a shelf life. Sydney was living on borrowed time, waiting for the inevitable moment when the world she had fabricated would collide with the reality she had discarded. She was a girl standing on the tracks, hearing the whistle of the oncoming train and choosing to close her eyes rather than move. The transition from a high-achieving student to an academic ghost didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of the self. By the time the winter of 2020 settled over Akron, the girl who had once been the pride of Scarsdale Drive was no longer a student at Mount Union University. She was a professional actress, performing for an audience of 2. The psychological infrastructure required to maintain a lie of this magnitude is exhausting, a constant low-level hum of anxiety that never truly dissipates. Sydney had been dismissed from the university in December 2019, a casualty of grades that had slipped beyond the point of recovery, while her peers were returning to campus for the spring semester with new textbooks and renewed ambitions. Sydney was returning to a hollowed-out version of her life. She was paying for a sorority membership at Alpha Chi Omega for a university she was no longer allowed to attend. She was essentially paying for the privilege of continuing her masquerade. The daily logistics were a masterpiece of deception. Every morning, as the gray Ohio light filtered through the curtains, Sydney would follow the same ritual she had since freshman year. She would dress in the casual uniform of a college student, oversized sweatshirts, leggings, hair pulled back, and join her parents for a brief breakfast. She listened as Brenda talked about her upcoming day at the hospital, about the families she was helping, and the small victories she witnessed in the pediatric wards. Sydney would nod, she would smile, and then she would offer her own fabricated itinerary. She spoke of lectures she wasn't going to, professors she hadn't seen in months, and study groups that didn't exist. When she pulled out of the driveway, the performance didn't end. It just changed venues. For those first few months of 2020, Sydney Powell spent her days as a nomad. She would drive 40 miles toward the campus to keep the GPS on her phone from raising any red flags with her parents. Or she would drift between local parks and coffee shop parking lots. She spent hours sitting in the driver's seat of her car, the engine idling against the biting cold, watching the digital clock on her dashboard click away the minutes of a life she was no longer living. The weight of the silence in that car must have been deafening. She spent her time scrolling through social media, watching her sorority sisters post about Greek life and late-night study sessions. And she would interact. She would leave comments. She would like photos, maintaining a digital presence that suggested she was right there with them. It was a form of self-inflicted torture, staying tethered to a world that had already cast her out. Back in Akron, the administrative clock was ticking. Mount Union is a private, well-ordered institution, and their records department is not easily ignored. When a student is dismissed for academic reasons, the university doesn't just stop at the student. They have protocols for communication. Throughout January and February, letters began arriving at the Powell home. These weren't just standard mailings. They were the physical manifestations of Sydney's failure. She became an expert at the intercept. She knew exactly when the mail carrier arrived on Scarsdale Drive. She learned the sound of the truck's engine, the specific thud of the mail hitting the floor or the box. If a letter from the registrar's office arrived, it vanished before Brenda or Stephen ever knew it existed. Sydney was effectively censoring her parents' reality, cutting out the pieces of the world that didn't fit her narrative. But the university's concern wasn't limited to paper. There were emails, dozens of them, landing in Sydney's inbox. They spoke of next steps, enrollment status, and required meetings. She ignored them all, perhaps hoping that if she didn't acknowledge the reality, it would simply cease to exist. It was a strategy of total avoidance, a psychological retreat into a corner where the only thing that mattered was making it through the next 24 hours without the truth coming out. The relationship between Sydney and Brenda is the most tragic element of this lead-up. Brenda was a woman who dealt with the most difficult truths for a living. She saw children at their most vulnerable. She saw parents facing their worst nightmares. If Sydney had simply sat her mother down and told her the truth, that the pressure had become too much, that she had failed, the likely outcome would have been a supportive, if disappointed, conversation. Brenda was a fixer, a caregiver. She would have found a way to move forward. But Sydney didn't see a mother who helped parents. She saw a mother who was perfect. To Sydney, Brenda wasn't a person to confide in. She was a standard to be met. The higher Brenda's reputation grew in the community, the more impossible it became for Sydney to admit she was anything less than the girl on the graduation posters. The lie wasn't just about grades. It was about preserving the only version of herself she believed her parents could love. By early March, the walls were no longer just closing in, they were touching. The university's Associate Dean of Students, Michelle Gavin, had noticed the lack of response. The situation had moved past a simple academic dismissal and into a question of safety and administrative closure. The dean needed to speak with Sydney, or her parents. The pressure inside Sydney must have reached a fever pitch. Every phone call to the house was a potential landmine. Every time Brenda picked up her cell phone, Sydney's heart must have stopped. She was a girl living in a house of glass, and the hammers were already swinging. She had no exit strategy, no plan for what would happen when the lie finally broke. She was simply waiting for the collision. And on the morning of March 3rd, 2020, the impact finally came. The morning of March 3rd, 2020, began with a deceptive normalcy. A Tuesday morning in Akron that should have been defined by the mundane rituals of a suburban household. But instead, it became the day the glass house finally shattered. It was just before 11 a.m. The air inside the house on Scarsdale Drive was likely thick with the quiet tension of a secret that had grown too large for its container. Brenda Powell was home that morning, a rarity for a woman so dedicated to her clinical duties at the hospital. And Sydney was there too, still maintaining the facade of a student on spring break or between classes. The catalyst for the catastrophe was a phone call from Mount Union University. Associate Dean of Students Michelle Gavin had been trying to resolve Sydney's status for weeks, and that morning, she finally dialed the Powell residence. When Brenda answered the phone, she was stepping into a reality she hadn't been permitted to see for months. On the other end of the line, Dean Gavin was professional and direct. She began to explain the reason for her call, the administrative necessity of discussing Sydney's dismissal from the university. As the words traveled through the wires and into the kitchen, the air must have left the room. Brenda, ever the advocate and the fixer, likely struggled to reconcile the voice on the phone with the daughter standing only a few feet away. Gavin later described the conversation as initially calm, but the confusion was immediate. Brenda asked for clarification. She needed to understand how her daughter, the girl who left every morning for campus, the girl who wore her sorority letters with pride, could possibly have been dismissed back in December. The dean held her ground, confirming the academic failure and the subsequent expulsion. It was a cold, hard fact meeting a warm, soft lie. Sydney was in the room. She was watching her mother's face as decades of trust were dismantled in a matter of seconds. The golden child was being erased in real time, replaced by a stranger who had spent 3 months perfecting a masterpiece of deception. The psychological pressure that had been mounting since December finally found its vent. As Brenda continued to speak with the dean, trying to process the timeline of the deceit, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted from shock to something much more volatile. The sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of a clock, were eclipsed by the roaring sound of a daughter's world ending. There was no exit left, no more letters to intercept, no more parking lots to hide in. The dean remained on the line. She could hear the muffled sounds of a burgeoning confrontation. Brenda began to question Sydney, her voice likely rising not in anger, but in a desperate attempt to find a logic that wasn't there. She asked Sydney why she hadn't come to them, why she had chosen to live in a lie for so long. Then, the audio record of the morning took a terrifying turn. Through the receiver, Dean Gavin heard a sudden, violent thud. It was a heavy, metallic sound, the impact of an iron skillet against flesh and bone. This wasn't a calculated move. It was a frantic, primal explosion of shame and rage. Sydney had reached for the nearest object, an iron skillet sitting in the kitchen, and struck her mother. The phone remained active. It lay on the counter or the floor, a digital witness to the unthinkable. Gavin heard the screams. She heard Brenda crying out, a sound that shifted from confusion to sheer, agonizing terror. The dean, 40 miles away in her office, was paralyzed by the sounds of a struggle she couldn't see. She heard the rhythmic, sickening thud of repeated blows. Inside the kitchen, the scene was chaotic. The skillet had been the beginning, but it wasn't enough to silence the truth. Sydney moved from the heavy iron to a steak knife. The violence escalated into a frenzy. Brenda, the woman who had spent her life healing, was now fighting for her life against the one person she had nurtured above all others. There was a struggle. Forensic evidence later showed that Brenda fought back. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms told the story of a mother trying to ward off the blade of her own child. But Sydney was younger, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of adrenaline and the total collapse of her identity. She stabbed her mother nearly 30 times. On the phone, Dean Gavin heard the thump, thump, thump of the attack. She heard the gurgling sounds of a woman losing her ability to breathe. She heard the silence that eventually followed the screams. And then, she heard Sydney's voice. It wasn't a voice of remorse. According to the Dean's testimony, Sydney didn't sound like a girl who had just realized what she'd done. She sounded like someone trying to regain control of the narrative. Sydney picked up the phone. She didn't speak to Gavin directly at first. Instead, she began a frantic performance. She began to stage the scene of a home invasion. Gavin heard Sydney shouting, as if to an invisible intruder telling them to get out. She heard the sound of glass shattering, Sydney breaking a window to create the illusion of a forced entry. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to rewrite the ending of the story, even as her mother lay dying on the linoleum floor. When Sydney finally spoke into the phone, her voice was frantic. She told the Dean that someone had broken in, that her mother was hurt, but the Dean had heard too much. She had heard the sequence of events. She had heard the lack of any other voice in that kitchen. The digital bridge between Mount Union and Scarsdale Drive had captured the truth before the lie could even be formulated. The call ended, and the house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Sydney was left alone with the body of the woman who had been her greatest champion. The blood on the floor was the final, indelible proof of her failure. In those minutes after the attack, Sydney didn't call 911. Instead, she called her father. She reached Stephen Powell and told him the same story she had shouted into the phone for the Dean's benefit. She claimed an intruder had attacked Brenda. She sounded like a victim. She played the part of the terrified daughter, all while the steak knife and the skillet sat nearby, stained with the evidence of her snap. By the time sirens began to wail in the distance, the neighborhood on Scarsdale Drive was still quiet. The neighbors hadn't heard the screams. They hadn't seen the struggle. To the outside world, it was still a Tuesday morning in a perfect suburb. But inside the Powell home, the golden child was gone, and in her place stood a girl covered in the reality she had tried so hard to kill. The first responders who arrived on the scene found a house of horrors. They found Brenda still clinging to life by a thread, and Sydney distraught and seemingly broken. The performance was ongoing, but as the paramedics worked to save Brenda and the police began to secure the kitchen, the cracks in Sydney's new story were already appearing. The iron skillet was there, the steak knife was there, and 40 miles away, an associate dean was already telling the police what she had heard over the line. The confrontation wasn't just a physical fight. It was the violent collision of two worlds, the world of Scarsdale Drive excellence and the world of the parking lot nomad. When those two realities hit each other, Brenda Powell was the one caught in the impact. Sydney had killed her mother to keep her from knowing the truth, only to ensure that the truth would be the only thing the world would ever remember about her. The kitchen of the Powell home was a space designed for order, a bright, functional room where Brenda likely felt most at peace. But on the morning of March 3rd, 2020, that order was about to be obliterated by a secret that had finally reached its expiration date. Earlier that morning, Stephen Powell had attempted to log into the university's tuition portal, only to find himself locked out. A technical hurdle that led him to contact Mount Union directly. The truth he uncovered was a physical blow. His daughter hadn't been a student for months. After Stephen shared this devastating revelation with Brenda, she did what any protective, concerned mother would do. She left her post at the hospital and drove home to help her daughter navigate the wreckage of her lies. When Brenda entered the house on Scarsdale Drive, the atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was suffocating. She sat in the kitchen and dialed the university to confirm the details Stephen had given her. On the other end of the line was Associate Dean of Students Michelle Gavin. As the two women spoke, the administrative reality of Sydney's dismissal was laid bare, and Sydney was standing right there, watching the final pillars of her fabricated life collapse in real time. To Sydney, the sound of her mother's voice on that phone wasn't just a conversation, it was the sound of her own social and familial execution. The transition from a verbal confrontation to a lethal assault happened with a speed that defied logic. The primary weapon was a heavy cast iron skillet, a mundane household object that, in an instant, became a blunt force instrument of rage. Through the open phone line, Dean Gavin heard a sudden, rhythmic series of thuds, a heavy thump, thump, thump that echoed through the receiver 40 miles away. She heard Brenda's screams, sounds of pure, unadulterated terror that eventually dissolved into a chilling, gurgling silence. But the skillet wasn't enough to satisfy the eruptive pressure inside Sydney, in what prosecutors would later describe as a cold, purposeful decision to ensure the end of a life. Sydney switched weapons. She reached for a steak knife. This wasn't a single, impulsive strike. It was a sustained, frenzied attack. Brenda Powell was stabbed nearly 30 times, with the majority of the wounds concentrated on her neck. The ferocity of the assault was so extreme that it left the kitchen in a state that looked more like a battlefield than a suburban home. The golden child was no longer just hiding a secret. She was actively, violently erasing the only person who had the power to expose it. While the phone line to the university remained active, the audio record captured a secondary horror. After the screams stopped, the university official called back, desperate to understand what she had just heard. Sydney picked up the receiver. In a chilling display of presence of mind, she attempted to mimic her mother's voice, trying to convince the dean that everything was fine and the call had simply been a misunderstanding. It was a desperate, high-stakes performance that failed almost immediately. The dean, having heard the sounds of the struggle, knew that the woman she was speaking to was not Brenda Powell. She alerted the authorities, initiating a welfare check that would soon pull the curtain back on the entire tragedy. In the minutes before the first responders arrived, Sydney shifted from an executioner to a set decorator. She understood that she needed a new story, one where she was a victim, not a perpetrator. She moved through the kitchen, ignoring the body of her mother, and focused on the mechanics of a break-in. She took a heavy object and shattered a window at the back of the house, creating a physical entry point for a phantom intruder. She left the sliding glass door ajar and messed with the vertical blinds, ensuring that bloodstains were visible on the fabric to suggest a struggle with an outsider. As the sirens grew louder, Sydney began her final act of the morning. When the first police officers pulled into the driveway, they didn't find a girl hiding in shame. They found a girl in the throes of a public breakdown. She was standing outside, screaming at an invisible assailant, demanding they leave her home. She told the arriving officers that an intruder had burst into the house and that her mother had heroically told her to run for safety. She claimed that she had only just returned to find her mother on the floor. The scene inside the house told a different story. The officers found blood on the blinds, and Brenda lying in the back of the house, still clinging to a heartbeat but fading fast. Sydney herself was covered in signs of the struggle, not the defensive wounds of a victim, but the telltale marks of an attacker. Her own hands were actively bleeding from cuts she had sustained, while the knife slipped during the frenzy. She stood on the pavement, provided her name to the authorities, and then she simply dropped. She fell to the ground in a state of apparent catatonia, staring into space and refusing to answer any further questions. Paramedics rushed Brenda to Cleveland Clinic Akron General, the very hospital where she had spent decades saving others. But the damage was too extensive. The combination of blunt force trauma from the skillet and the catastrophic blood loss from the 30 stab wounds proved fatal. Brenda Powell, the woman who had spent her life as a beacon of empathy, was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Back at the house, the investigation was already pivoting. The broken window didn't look right. The glass had fallen in a way that suggested it was broken from the inside, not the out. The intruder had left no footprints in the soft Ohio dirt outside. And most damningly, there was the open phone line to Mount Union, a digital witness that had recorded the sounds of a daughter's secret becoming a mother's death sentence. The arrival of the first patrol units turned the sterile piece of Scarsdale Drive into a high-intensity forensic theater. Detectives stepped into a house that had been staged to look like a nightmare. But for the experienced eye, the scene felt less like a crime of opportunity and more like a poorly rehearsed play. The intruder story, the centerpiece of Sydney's frantic narrative, began to disintegrate before the first roll of yellow tape was even unfurled. The most glaring red herring was the shattered window at the rear of the residence. In a standard home invasion, the physics of entry are predictable. Glass is forced inward, shattering across the floor as a perpetrator gains access. But at the Powell home, the glass told a different story. The vast majority of the shards were discovered on the grass and mulch outside. The window hadn't been smashed to get in. It had been smashed to get out of the truth. It was a clumsy attempt at misdirection, a physical impossibility that immediately shifted the focus from a phantom stranger to the person left standing in the kitchen. Then there was the perimeter. Akron police conducted a sweep of the soft, damp ground surrounding the house, searching for the heavy footprints of a fleeing assailant. They found nothing. No crushed grass, no mud tracked onto the porch, no DNA left on the gate. The march soil was a silent witness that confirmed no one had approached or left that house in the minutes leading up to the sirens. Inside the kitchen, the forensics grew even more damning. The detectives focused on the trail of blood that coated the linoleum and the vertical blinds. Sydney had claimed she was a victim who had been forced to witness the attack. Yet the injuries on her own body didn't align with that of a bystander. The cuts on her hands and fingers were deep, but they weren't defensive. There were no marks on her forearms or palms suggesting she had warded off a blade. Instead, the lacerations were consistent with slippage, the common occurrence when an attacker's hand slides down the handle of a knife as it meets resistance. Her own blood was mixed with Brenda's in a way that suggested they were both part of the same violent motion. The investigation then moved to the digital record, the most objective witness of all. Detectives seized Sydney's laptop and phone, expecting to find the typical life of a college sophomore. Instead, they found a ghost. The parking lot nomad was revealed through months of GPS data. The phone showed her sitting for 6 hours at a time in a Starbucks parking lot or idling at a local park, miles away from the Mount Union campus. The logs showed she had been intercepting every piece of communication from the university, deleting emails from the dean, and silencing notifications from the registrar. But the black box of this case was the phone call with Associate Dean Michelle Gavin. When investigators interviewed the dean, the red herrings were officially swept away. Gavin didn't just hear the aftermath, she heard the transition. She described the chilling silence that preceded the attack, the lack of any third voice or heavy footsteps that would indicate a break-in. She recounted the moment Sydney picked up the phone after the screaming stopped, attempting to mimic Brenda's voice to convince the university that everything was fine. It was a level of calculated deception that suggested Sydney wasn't in the midst of a mental break. She was in the midst of a cover-up. As the physical evidence mounted, the police turned their attention to the catatonic state Sydney had displayed on the lawn, while she sat in the hospital, staring blankly at the wall and refusing to speak. Medical staff monitored her vitals. They noted that her heart rate and blood pressure remained remarkably stable, inconsistent with the physiological profile of someone suffering from a true dissociative break or acute trauma. To the investigators, it looked like a tactical silence. The community's reaction added a layer of social pressure to the investigation. Rumors flooded the suburban streets of Akron. People couldn't reconcile the golden child they knew with the bloodied kitchen on Scarsdale Drive. The neighbors spoke of a family that was the envy of the block, a daughter who was always smiling, a mother who was a saint. The fear wasn't just that a murder had happened, it was the realization that the perfection they all strived for could be a mask for something so hollow. Detectives also scrutinized the father, Stephen Powell, but only to understand the depth of the deceit. He described the moment he discovered the tuition portal lockout, the initial confusion that turned into the realization that his daughter's entire life was a fabrication. His grief was visceral, but his testimony provided the final piece of the motive. The why wasn't about hatred, it was about the absolute, paralyzing fear of being ordinary. Sydney had spent 20 years being the best, and when she couldn't be the best anymore, she decided she would rather be a murderer than a failure. By the time the search warrants were fully executed, the red herrings had vanished. The intruder was a myth, the break-in was a lie, and the catatonia was a performance. All that remained was a girl who had traded her mother's life for a few more hours of a secret. The courtroom in 2023 became a battleground of psychological theories, a clash between the image of a cold-blooded killer and a girl lost in a mental fog. The defense presented a narrative of undiagnosed schizophrenia, arguing that Sydney was in the grip of a psychotic break when she reached for that skillet. They brought in experts who spoke of a mind fractured by the weight of expectations, a girl who didn't even recognize the woman she was attacking. But the prosecution countered with a different diagnosis: narcissism and desperation. They pointed to the 3 months of meticulous lies, the staged break-in, and the way she tried to mimic Brenda's voice on the phone. This wasn't madness, they argued. It was a frantic attempt to preserve a brand. Despite her father and grandmother pleading for mercy, the jury wasn't moved. In September 2023, Sydney Powell was found guilty on all counts, including murder and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The golden child had finally traded her suburban crown for a state-issued jumpsuit. The house on Scarsdale Drive stands as a silent monument to the lethal cost of a perfect image, a home where the grass is green, but the memories are permanently stained. Brenda Powell spent her life ensuring children felt safe, never realizing the greatest threat was the daughter she tried to protect from failure. Sydney's secret was never worth a mother's life, and the heavy silence remaining in that kitchen is the only truth left. The golden child is gone, leaving only a story of how far a girl will go to keep the world from seeing her fall. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. Highland Heights, October 2012. Inside a sterile interrogation room, a 21-year-old honor student is left alone. She isn't trembling. Instead, she stands and begins to twirl. Shayna Hubers hums Amazing Grace to the security camera, her silhouette spinning against the gray cinder blocks. Moments ago, she confessed to pumping 6 rounds into her boyfriend, telling detectives she finally gave him the nose job he wanted. This is the reality of a killer who didn't just pull the trigger. She danced on his grave. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Ryan Poston was a man built from the high expectations and deep roots of northern Kentucky, a 29-year-old whose life was measured in billable hours and the quiet pride of a family that saw him as their greatest achievement. He lived in a world of legal briefs, leather-bound volumes, and the sharp, clean air of Highland Heights. Born into a family that valued intellect and community service, Ryan had never been one to shy away from the hard work of living up to his name. He was a graduate of Indiana University and later the Salmon P. Chase College of Law, a place where the curriculum was designed to break the weak. But Ryan had emerged not just with a degree, but with a reputation for being a rare breed, an attorney who actually cared about the people behind the paperwork. In his law practice in Cincinnati, he was becoming a formidable force in personal injury law, representing those who had been overlooked or cast aside by the system. His colleagues described him as a man with a brilliant legal mind, but they spoke even more frequently about his striking blue eyes and the way he could disarm a room with a single, self-deprecating joke. He was the kind of person who seemed to have a natural gravitational pull, someone who stayed late at the office not for the overtime, but because he couldn't stand the thought of leaving a task unfinished. Standing over 6 feet tall and meticulously fit, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had finally grown into his own skin. His home was a reflection of his rising status, a modern, impeccably kept condominium in Highland Heights. It was a place of glass, steel, and order, located in a quiet community where the most exciting event of the week was often the local high school football game. Ryan was a man of strict routines. He liked his coffee strong, his shirts professionally pressed, and his weekends spent with his close-knit family in nearby Fort Thomas. His mother and his father, Jay Poston, were his anchors. He was the eldest of 3 sisters, and to them, he was more than just a brother. He was a protector, a confidant, and a constant source of laughter. To the Poston family, Ryan was the golden boy, not because he was flawless, but because he was genuine. He had a way of making the people around him feel like they were the only people in the room. Across the state in Lexington, another story was unfolding, one framed by the cold, unforgiving light of academic perfection. Shayna Hubers was 21 years old, a student at the University of Kentucky who functioned with the intensity of a high-performance machine. To her professors and peers, she was an enigma, a psychology major with a near-perfect GPA who seemed to treat every assignment as a battle to be won. She was articulate, poised, and possessed a vocabulary that she used as both a shield and a weapon. Those who shared classrooms with her in Lexington remembered her as intense, the kind of student who sat in the front row, challenged the curriculum, and never accepted anything less than total victory in a debate. She was fascinated by the darker corners of the human psyche, spending her nights researching personality disorders and the mechanics of manipulation, topics she discussed with a detached, clinical fascination that often made her classmates uncomfortable. She had grown up in a middle-class environment where her intelligence was her primary currency. Shayna was the girl who didn't just meet standards, she sought to redefine them. But beneath the veneer of the honor student and the overachiever, there was a jagged, desperate need for attention that grades alone couldn't satisfy. Her social media presence was a curated museum of her own life, a place where she documented her thoughts and movements with a meticulousness that suggested she was constantly performing for an audience. While Ryan's life was built on the tangible reality of the law, family, and physical fitness, Shayna's life was increasingly built on the digital landscape of validation and perceived status. She was a woman who didn't just want to be loved, she wanted to be the protagonist of an all-consuming narrative. In late 2011, Highland Heights was a town of quiet streets and manicured lawns, a place where people moved to escape the noise of the city. It was the kind of community where a domestic disturbance was a rare, shocking event, something that happened in other places to other people. Ryan Poston was a fixture of this community, a man who represented its best aspirations. Shayna Hubers was a visitor from a different world, a world of obsessive digital connection and academic pressure. They were 2 paths moving at high speed toward an intersection that neither of them could see coming. Ryan was looking for someone to share his success with, someone who could match his wit and appreciate his ambition. Shayna was looking for a person who could serve as the ultimate prize in her personal psychodrama. The contrast was absolute: the man who spent his days advocating for others, and the woman who spent her nights obsessing over herself. The collision was inevitable, and it would leave the golden boy silent and the honor student dancing in a room with no windows. The spark that ignited the tragedy didn't occur in a crowded room or through a chance meeting at a Lexington coffee shop. It began with the clinical blue glow of a Facebook friend request. In late 2011, Shayna Hubers reached out to Ryan Poston, a simple digital gesture that Ryan accepted with the casual indifference of a man who had no idea he was inviting a predator into his life. For Ryan, Shayna was an intelligent, academically driven student who could hold her own in a debate, a welcome change from the superficiality he often encountered. But for Shayna, Ryan was more than a boyfriend. He was the ultimate acquisition. The relationship didn't evolve so much as it metastasized. Within weeks, the digital footprint of their connection became a terrifying record of one-sided obsession. Shayna didn't just communicate, she inundated. Her presence in Ryan's life was marked by the relentless buzz of his smartphone, a sound that would eventually trigger a physical sense of dread in the young attorney. Investigators would later be stunned by the sheer volume of her output, messages numbering in the thousands, sometimes exceeding 70 to 100 texts in a single 24-hour period. If Ryan didn't respond within her self-imposed time frame, the messages shifted from flirtatious to vitriolic. She demanded to know his location, the names of his companions, and the contents of his thoughts. She was attempting to map every inch of his existence, leaving no room for a life that didn't include her. As 2012 progressed, the dynamic settled into an exhausting, toxic loop. Ryan would reach a breaking point, smothered by the weight of her demands, and attempt to end the relationship, only for Shayna to deploy a sophisticated arsenal of manipulation to pull him back. She was a psychology major who understood the levers of human emotion. She would oscillate between being the perfect girlfriend and a woman on the verge of a total psychological collapse. She used threats of self-harm and elaborate displays of grief to anchor herself to Ryan's inherent sense of decency. Ryan admitted to his friends that he felt a profound sense of pity for her. He saw her as a brilliant girl who was deeply off, and he felt a responsibility to help her find balance. He didn't realize that his compassion was being used as a leash. Ryan's inner circle watched this erosion of his personality with growing alarm. His best friends noticed that the once confident golden boy was becoming distracted and increasingly anxious. During their nights out in Cincinnati or Fort Thomas, Ryan was never truly present. His eyes were constantly darting to his phone, bracing for the next wall of text. He began to describe the relationship as a job, a project he was failing to complete. One specific incident stayed with his friends. A night when Ryan sat in the dark of his Highland Heights condo, refusing to turn on the lights or make a sound, while Shayna stood on his porch and knocked for hours. She didn't scream or make a scene. She simply waited in the silence. A patient sentry convinced that her persistence would eventually break his will. The stalking behavior began to bleed into his professional life. She would show up at his law office, uninvited, creating awkward encounters with his colleagues. To the outside world, she maintained the facade of the devoted, supportive partner. But to Ryan, she was becoming a source of genuine fear. He told his father, Jay, that he was walking on eggshells, worried that any attempt to finally, truly leave would result in a catastrophe. He was a man who understood the mechanics of conflict through the law, but he was completely unequipped for the irrational, narcissistic rage of a woman who viewed his autonomy as an act of betrayal. By the summer of 2012, Ryan was desperately looking for a way out. He began to distance himself more permanently, but Shayna's grip only tightened. She would send him photos of herself crying, followed by messages claiming she was the only one who truly loved him for who he was. She had created a narrative where they were twin flames, two brilliant minds against a world that didn't understand them. But for Ryan, the fire was consuming him. He was losing weight, his work was suffering, and the meticulously ordered life he had built was being swallowed by the chaos she brought across the state line from Lexington. The contrast between the life Ryan wanted and the reality he was living became stark when he met Audrey Bolt, a former Miss Ohio. Audrey represented everything Shayna was not. She was stable, successful, and lived in the same world of professional poise that Ryan occupied. When Ryan began to talk to Audrey, he saw a glimpse of a future free from the digital shackles of Highland Heights. He felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. But Shayna was watching. She monitored his interactions and sensed the shift in his energy. To her, Audrey Bolta wasn't just a romantic rival. She was a threat to Shayna's carefully constructed reality. In the weeks leading up to the final confrontation, Shayna's messages took on a darker, more possessive tone. She stopped asking for his time and started demanding it as her right. She viewed Ryan as an extension of herself, an object that belonged to her by right of her superior intellect and the sacrifice she claimed to have made for the relationship. Ryan's friends begged him to get a restraining order, to change his locks, to disappear. But Ryan believed he could handle it. He believed that if he was just firm enough, if he was just clear enough, she would finally understand that it was over. He was a man who believed in the power of words to resolve disputes. He didn't know that for Shayna Hubers, the conversation was already over, and the only thing left was the performance of the end. The digital obsession had reached its zenith. Every buzz of the phone was a reminder that he was not free. Every knock on the door was a reminder that his sanctuary was compromised. As October 12th approached, Ryan Poston believed he was preparing for a new beginning, a date with a woman who made him feel like the man he used to be. He didn't know that Shayna was also preparing, not for a breakup, but for a permanent solution to the man who dared to try and walk away from her. He could smell the scent of her perfume lingering in his guest room weeks after she'd stayed there, a cloying, sweet aroma that felt like a marking of territory. He found her hairs on his pillows, a physical manifestation of an intruder he couldn't quite evict. The silence of the condo when she wasn't there was heavy, pregnant with the expectation of her return. Ryan was living in a state of hypervigilance, his ears tuned to the sound of tires on the gravel or the faint click of the gate. He was a prisoner in a home he paid for, bound by a digital cord that Shayna refused to cut. The honor student had successfully turned his life into a psychological thriller, and as the autumn air turned cold in Highland Heights, the final act was about to begin. October 12, 2012, began as the first day of what Ryan Poston believed would be his true independence. For months, the 29-year-old attorney had been trapped in the gravity of a relationship that felt less like a partnership and more like a long-term siege. But that Friday was different. He had finally been clear. He had been firm. He told his family and his colleagues that the cycle with Shayna Hubers was over. Not a temporary pause, but a permanent severance. He was a man who appreciated order, and he spent the early evening hours restoring it to his Highland Heights condominium. He moved with a sense of purpose, preparing for a date with Audrey Bolt, the former Miss Ohio. This wasn't just a social engagement, it was a symbolic crossing of a threshold. He was stepping back into the world of the living, leaving the shadow of Shayna's obsession behind him. The condo was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock in the hallway. Ryan stood in front of his bedroom mirror, meticulously adjusting his tie. He was a man who took pride in his appearance, standing over 6 feet tall with the lean, athletic build of someone who spent his limited free time in the gym. He looked at the reflection of a successful lawyer, a man whose future was once again his own to shape. The air in the room was cool, conditioned against the lingering humidity of the Kentucky autumn. He had no way of knowing that the silence of his sanctuary was about to be shattered by the very person he thought he had finally escaped. Around 8:50 p.m., the door to the condo opened. Shayna Hubers didn't need to force her way in. She still possessed a key, a metal tether she refused to relinquish. She didn't arrive with suitcases to move out. She arrived with the heavy, jagged weight of a woman who had realized her leverage was gone. She had learned about the date with Audrey. She knew that Ryan was, for the first time, truly looking past her. To a narcissist, abandonment is not just a heartbreak. It is a total annihilation of the self. If she could not be the center of his world, she would ensure that his world ceased to exist. The confrontation didn't begin with screams that the neighbors could hear through the walls. It began in the kitchen and dining area, a space of granite countertops and modern appliances that now served as the stage for a psychological standoff. Ryan was sitting at the dining table, perhaps still wearing his suit trousers, trying to maintain the professional composure that was his trademark. He used the language of the law, measured, logical, and firm. He told her she needed to leave. He told her that he was moving on. He told her that there was no version of the future that included her. But Shayna wasn't listening to his words. She was watching his mouth move, seeing the man she owned dare to speak of a life without her. The tension in the room escalated with a sickening velocity. Shayna would later claim that Ryan became violent, that he pushed her, that he threw her against the furniture. But the room remained eerily pristine. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, no signs of the life-or-death struggle she would eventually describe to detectives. There was only the .38 caliber handgun. It was Ryan's weapon, kept for protection in a world where he often dealt with volatile legal clients. Shayna reached for it. The cold, heavy steel of the revolver felt like the only thing in the world that was real. In an instant, the power dynamic of the last 3 years was condensed into the pull of a trigger. The first shot was a concussive blast that ripped through the quiet of the condo. The lead projectile struck Ryan square in the chest, a massive, blunt force that collapsed his lung and sent him spiraling off his chair. He hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud, his body instantly going into shock. He wasn't dead, but he was neutralized. He lay there, gasping for air that his chest could no longer contain, looking up at the woman who had spent thousands of hours professing her love for him. Shayna didn't pause. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the gun in a fit of sudden remorse. She stepped toward the man on the floor. The second and third shots followed in rapid succession. She fired into his back as he tried to curl away, a primitive, desperate attempt to shield his vitals from the heat and the lead. The room began to fill with the acrid, metallic scent of cordite, a smell that is thick, biting, and stays in the back of the throat long after the smoke has cleared. The sound of the shots was deafening in the confined space, a series of rhythmic explosions that signaled the end of Ryan Poston. As Ryan lay dying on his own floor, his life's blood beginning to pool on the wood, Shayna delivered the most chilling blows of all. She stood directly over him, a bird's-eye view of the man she had shattered. She pointed the barrel at his temple and fired. The fourth shot entered his brain, extinguishing the light of the brilliant attorney instantly. But even with the life gone from his eyes, she wasn't finished with the performance. She aimed the .38 directly at his nose. She pulled the trigger a fifth time. The bullet tore through his facial structure, a disfiguring, unnecessary shot that served no purpose other than to humiliate the corpse. This was the shot she would later describe with a haunting, casual detachment as giving him the nose job he always wanted. It was a final act of spite against a man who was no longer there to feel it. A sixth shot rang out, a stray round fired in the frantic, adrenaline-fueled climax of her rage. Then the silence returned. The condo was still again, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was heavy with the smell of blood and gunpowder. Shayna stood in the center of the room, the revolver still warm in her hand. She looked down at Ryan. He was no longer the golden boy of northern Kentucky. He was a collection of exit wounds and ruined potential. She didn't run to the phone to save him. She didn't try to stem the bleeding with a towel. She walked through the condo. She looked at herself in the mirror. She waited. She spent the next 10 to 15 minutes in a state of eerie, calculated processing. She wasn't just a killer. She was a student of psychology, and she was already beginning to draft the story she would tell. She needed to be the victim. She needed the 6 holes in Ryan's body to look like an act of desperate survival. She waited until she was certain that no medical intervention could bring him back. Only when the silence of the room felt absolute did she pick up her phone and dial 911. The voice that reached the emergency dispatcher wasn't a scream for help. It was a measured, almost clinical report. She told the operator that she had killed her boyfriend. She said he was beating her, and she had to do it. But even as the words left her mouth, she was surrounded by the evidence of her own narcissism. 6 shell casings, a man shot in the back, an execution-style wound to the face. When the Highland Heights police arrived, they expected a chaotic domestic scene. Instead, they found Shayna Hubers waiting for them, her clothes stained with the man she claimed to love, and an expression on her face that was neither grief nor terror. It was the look of someone who had just finished a difficult task and was waiting for the grade. One officer noticed that Ryan's date clothes, the suit, the polished shoes, were still neatly laid out, a heartbreaking reminder of the life he was supposed to lead that night. As they led her out into the cold October air, past the neighbors who were beginning to gather on their porches, Shayna didn't hang her head. She looked at the flashing blue and red lights with a strange, detached curiosity. She had ended the life of the golden boy, and in her mind, the night hadn't ended in a murder. It had ended in a victory. She had ensured that Ryan Poston would never go on another date, never win another case, and never, ever leave her again. The dancing killer was born in the blood-slicked dining room of a Highland Heights condo, and the performance was only just beginning. The transition from the blood-slicked hardwood of the condominium to the sterile, flickering fluorescent lights of the Highland Heights Police Department was seamless for Shayna Hubers. She sat in the small interrogation room, her hands still stained with the lead and copper residue of the .38 caliber rounds she had pumped into Ryan Poston's body. The air in the room was stale, smelling of industrial cleaner and the cold, metallic scent of the handcuffs that had recently bitten into her wrists. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't ask for water. She began to speak to the empty air and the hidden lens of the security camera, with a volume and a frequency that suggested she was performing for a global audience, not just a few stunned detectives in the observation room. Her behavior over the next several hours would become the centerpiece of the dancing killer moniker. Left alone to contemplate the fact that she had just ended a human life, Shayna didn't collapse into the heavy, soul-crushing grief one might expect. Instead, she stood up from her chair and began to move. The security footage captured a scene that defied conventional psychology. Shayna began to twirl. She spun in circles, her arms slightly raised, humming a melody that the detectives eventually identified as Amazing Grace. She looked at her reflection in the two-way mirror and began to sing the lyrics, her voice thin and eerie in the soundproofed room. She paced the perimeter of the floor, occasionally stopping to check her appearance, seemingly more concerned with how she looked on camera than the fact that Ryan Poston lay in a morgue. When the detectives finally sat across from her, the narrative she presented was a jarring mixture of rehearsed self-defense and unfiltered narcissistic rage. She spoke about Ryan as if he were a problematic project she had finally been forced to terminate. She told the investigators that Ryan was a very vain man, someone who spent too much time worrying about his looks and his status in the community. It was during this clinical deconstruction of his character that she uttered the phrase that would haunt the Poston family forever. She explained with a chillingly casual shrug that since Ryan had always talked about wanting a nose job, she had finally given him the one he wanted by shooting him in the face. She spoke about the disfigurement of his corpse, not with horror, but with the smug satisfaction of someone who had delivered a witty punchline. The lack of empathy in the room was absolute. She described the act of pulling the trigger 6 times as if she were describing a difficult chores she had finally completed. She told the officers that she was a straight A student and a good person, repeatedly pivoting the conversation back to her own accomplishments and the potential damage this incident might do to her academic career. She asked the detectives if she would be able to go back to school on Monday, or if they could at least let her check her phone so she could see her messages. The man she claimed to love was dead by her own hand, yet her primary concern was the disruption of her digital life and her GPA. She spoke about the shooting in the passive voice, as if the gun had simply gone off in her hand. But her details about the final shots, the ones delivered while Ryan lay defenseless, were too specific to be anything other than intentional. As the night wore on, her victim narrative began to fray at the edges. She told the police that Ryan had been abusive, that he had thrown her against the wall, and that she feared for her life. However, when the officers asked her to show them any marks, bruises, or signs of a struggle, she had nothing to offer. Her skin was pristine. Her clothes, though stained with Ryan's blood, were not torn. The detectives noted that she didn't seem to understand the gravity of the physical evidence. She believed that her superior intellect and her ability to articulate her feelings would be enough to override the forensic reality of the crime scene. She spent hours explaining why she was the real victim in the relationship, detailing every slight and every argument they had ever had, while Ryan's body was being processed only a few miles away. The social echo of her arrest began to ripple through Highland Heights as the sun rose the following morning. Rumors of the honors student who sang in the interrogation room started to leak out, transforming the local atmosphere from one of quiet suburban safety to one of profound unease. People who had known Shayna at the University of Kentucky were forced to reconcile the girl they saw in the front row of their psychology classes with the woman who was now being described as a cold-blooded executioner. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. To the public, she was a monster. To the detectives, she was a fascinating study in narcissistic personality disorder. But to herself, she was still the star of the show. She told the investigators that she knew she was very intelligent and that they would likely find her fascinating. She seemed to enjoy the attention, leaning into the camera and adjusting her hair as if she were being interviewed for a documentary. Even as they told her she was being charged with murder, her reaction was muted, focused entirely on how she could frame the story to the media. She was already building the defense that would dominate the next decade of her life, a story of a battered woman pushed to the brink. But as the detectives looked at the footage of her dancing alone in that room, they knew that the truth was much darker. They weren't looking at a woman in shock. They were looking at a killer who felt a profound sense of relief now that her possession could never walk away again. The interrogation ended not with a confession of guilt, but with Shayna Hubers asking if she could have a snack, her appetite seemingly unaffected by the 6 bullets she had just used to silence the Golden Boy of Kentucky. While Shayna performed for the cameras in the interrogation room, The Highland Heights forensics team was methodically dismantling her reality inside Ryan's condominium. They began with the floor, a map of dark, drying fluid and brass casings. 6 spent shells told a story that was diametrically opposed to her claims of a desperate struggle for survival. Investigators noted the placement of each shell with clinical precision. They weren't scattered in the frantic chaos of a fight, but clustered in a way that suggested a steady, advancing shooter who was in complete control of the space. The first forensic hurdle for the defense was the state of the dining area itself. It was eerily pristine. The table wasn't overturned. The chairs were largely in place. And Ryan's half-eaten meal sat undisturbed next to his glasses. There were no broken ornaments or scuff marks on the walls to support a narrative of a violent, room-clearing brawl. The autopsy was the centerpiece of the investigation, a cold, anatomical post-mortem that stripped away Shayna's adjectives and replaced them with the unforgiving physics of ballistics. The medical examiner identified 6 distinct entrance wounds, each one a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit the battered woman defense. The most damning evidence lay in the trajectory of the lead. The first shot had struck Ryan in the chest while he was still seated, the projectile traveling at a slightly downward angle. This immediately contradicted the claim of an imminent physical attack. If Ryan had been lunging at her with the intent to kill, the bullet would have entered at a flat or upward trajectory. Instead, the forensics suggested a man sitting in his own home, looking up at a woman who was already pointing a barrel at his heart. As Ryan fell from his chair and hit the hardwood, the forensic evidence showed that the shooter didn't pause. They found evidence of 2 shots fired directly into his back, wounds that could only be sustained if the victim was turning away or already incapacitated on the ground. One bullet had traveled through his torso at an angle that suggested he was curled in a primitive fetal position, trying to protect his vitals as the lead continued to fly. This wasn't a woman firing in a blind panic. This was a shooter finishing off a target that was no longer a threat. The bloodstain pattern analysis reinforced this. The primary pool of blood was concentrated where Ryan lay on the floor, with smaller secondary trails indicating he had tried to crawl or turn in his final moments of consciousness. The absence of high-velocity impact spatter on the walls at a height of 5 or 6 feet effectively ended the standing struggle theory. Everything significant had happened at ground level. The nose job shot, the 5th round, was the forensic climax of the investigation. The bullet had entered the bridge of Ryan's nose and traveled straight down into his throat. For this specific trajectory to occur, Ryan had to be lying flat on his back while Shayna stood directly over his head, pointing the revolver vertically downward. It was a shot of pure, unadulterated malice. There was no tactical reason to fire into a man's face after he had already taken 4 rounds to the torso and brain. It was a forensic signature of spite, a final, disfiguring act of ownership over a man who had dared to try and leave her. Back at the station, the physical examination of Shayna Hubers yielded nothing but more suspicion. The nurse and the detectives who processed her noted a complete lack of defensive wounds. Her fingernails weren't broken. There were no red marks on her neck. And there was no bruising on her arms that would indicate she had been fighting for her life. Her hair was neat, and her makeup was largely intact. The vicious beating she described simply hadn't left a single physical mark on her body. The only biological evidence on Shayna was the blood of the man she had just dismantled. The digital forensics team added another layer of concrete to the prosecution's case. Technicians recovered the deleted history of her obsession, a digital trail of stalking that stretched back through the entire 3-year relationship. They found evidence that she had been monitoring Ryan's communications and that she knew exactly who Audrey Bolta was. The motive recovered from the silicon and code wasn't fear. It was the oldest, most predictable catalyst in the history of crime: jealousy. Forensic psychologists analyzed her interrogation tapes and noted that her Amazing Grace performance was entirely devoid of the physiological markers of shock. Her heart rate had remained stable throughout the evening. Her breathing was controlled, and her focus remained entirely on her own image. She wasn't a woman in the throes of a psychological break. She was a woman who was finally savoring the total control she had achieved over Ryan's existence. The weapon itself, a Sig Sauer .38 caliber revolver, was tested for functionality. There was no mechanical failure and no evidence of a hair trigger. Every round required a deliberate, heavy pull of the trigger. To fire 6 times meant making 6 separate, conscious decisions to end a life. The investigation concluded that Shayna Hubers didn't act in the heat of a moment. She acted with a terrifying, mechanical precision. By the time the lead detectives finished their report, the case was airtight. The forensics had effectively silenced Shayna's voice. She could dance, she could sing, and she could tell stories about nose jobs. But the lead in Ryan Poston's body spoke a truth that no amount of singing could ever drown out. The condo in Highland Heights was no longer just a home. It was a forensic blueprint of an execution. Witness testimony from Ryan's friends and the Miss Ohio contestant, Audrey Bolt, provided the final timeline that trapped her. Audrey told detectives about the plans they had for that night, a simple dinner that Ryan was genuinely excited for. Her testimony proved that Ryan was mentally and emotionally miles away from Shayna. He was a man starting over. This provided the why that the forensics had already established. Shayna knew the clock was ticking on her influence. If she couldn't have the golden boy, then no one would. The investigation painted a picture of a calculated ambush, a woman who arrived at 8:50 p.m. because she knew her window of opportunity was closing at 9 p.m. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to ensure the date with Audrey Bolt never happened. The legal battle in Campbell County was a marathon of chilling testimony and procedural shocks. In 2015, the first jury saw through the battered woman defense, delivering a guilty verdict and a 40-year sentence. But a staggering oversight nearly derailed justice. It was discovered that one of the jurors was a convicted felon, legally barred from serving. This forced a complete retrial in 2018. The second trial was even more grueling. The prosecution leaned heavily on the nose job comment and the interrogation tapes, showing the jury the girl who danced while her boyfriend's body was still warm. The defense fought to paint Ryan as a controlling monster, but the 6 bullet holes told a different story. In August 2018, the second jury returned after only 5 hours of deliberation. Guilty. This time, the judge handed down a life sentence, ensuring the woman who laughed at her victim would have decades to contemplate his silence. For the Poston family, the gavel's final strike brought a heavy, hard-won peace, a definitive end to the digital ghost story. The Highland Heights condo has new tenants now, the walls patched and the blood scrubbed away. But the shadow of that October night remains, a reminder of how easily obsession can turn into execution. Ryan Poston was a man of the law, silenced by someone who viewed his life as a prop for her own drama. Today, Shayna Hubers is just a number in a Kentucky cell. No cameras to twirl for, no audience to manipulate. Only the silence of a life sentence and the echoes of the song she sang in the dark. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. The scale registered exactly 69 pounds, a weight reserved for a healthy 7-year-old, not a teenager standing nearly 6 feet tall. When authorities stepped into the suburban home in Norton Shores, Michigan, they didn't just find a crime scene, they found a digital archive of systematic destruction. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Shonda Vander Ark was a woman of clinical logic, a high-achieving law student who understood the weight of evidence. Yet, her most chilling work wasn't a legal motion. It was a 1,000-page manual of torture. By her sentencing in January 2024, it became clear that Timothy Ferguson's greatest threat wasn't a stranger. It was the woman who had studied the law just to learn how to break him. To understand the tragedy that unfolded within the walls of the house on Mellett Avenue, one must first look at the woman who designed its architecture of misery. Shonda Vander Ark was not the typical image of a neglected or struggling parent. She was, by all public accounts, an overachiever, a woman who, in her late 40s, had successfully navigated the grueling demands of law school while raising a family. Neighbors in the quiet, manicured suburb of Norton Shores saw a professional, a law clerk who worked in the chambers of a Muskegon County Circuit Court judge. She was a person who understood the weight of words, the structure of rules, and the finality of a sentence. This wasn't a household governed by chaos. It was governed by a mind that viewed empathy as a weakness and discipline as a mathematical equation. Shonda's life was a testament to cold, analytical precision. She had spent years climbing the academic ladder, eventually securing a position that placed her at the very heart of the American justice system. Colleagues described her as intelligent, perhaps a bit detached, but undeniably capable. She knew how to present a face to the world, a mask of competence that shielded the dark, experimental theories of parenting she was practicing behind closed doors. For Shanda, the law wasn't just a career, it was a tool for total jurisdiction. At the center of her orbit was Timothy Ferguson. To the world, Timothy was a 15-year-old boy with special needs, a child grappling with autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. These were conditions that required patience, specialized care, and a soft touch. But through Shonda's lens, Timothy's vulnerabilities were not medical hurdles. They were acts of defiance. She didn't see a son in need of support. She saw a subject that needed to be brought to heel. Her legal training seemed to merge with a burgeoning sociopathy, leading her to believe that if she could just find the right protocol, she could fix or break him entirely. The family's move from Oklahoma to Michigan in 2021 was the final catalyst for Timothy's isolation. In their previous life, there were at least remnants of a social safety net, but the relocation to Norton Shores effectively severed the boy's ties to the outside world. Shonda chose a house that provided the perfect cover, a respectable, middle-class dwelling in a neighborhood where people kept to themselves and respected the privacy of a busy professional. Once the moving boxes were unpacked, the house on Millette Avenue became a private fiefdom. Timothy was withdrawn from public school under the guise of homeschooling, a move that ensured no teacher or mandatory reporter would ever catch a glimpse of his declining physical state. Inside the home, the atmosphere was one of stifling, calculated silence. Shonda didn't scream or lose her temper in a way that would alert the neighbors. Instead, she spoke in the same measured tones she used at the courthouse. She began to view Timothy's special needs as behavioral problems that could be litigated away through a series of increasingly creative and cruel punishments. She was a woman who lived in the details, and it was in those details that Timothy's nightmare was constructed. She documented his transgressions with the meticulousness of a court reporter, building a case against her own son in a private trial, where she was the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner. Timothy's older brother, Paul, was also a resident of this house, but his role was evolving into something far more sinister than a sibling. Under Shanda's influence, the household hierarchy was being rewritten. She was the architect, and Paul was being groomed as the foreman. The brothers were close in age, yet Shanda was successfully driving a wedge of authority between them, teaching Paul that his brother's suffering was a necessary byproduct of his rehabilitation. By early 2022, the woman who spent her days assisting a judge in the pursuit of justice was spending her nights refining a system of torture that would eventually shock the nation. She was brilliant, she was educated, and she was utterly devoid of the most basic human instinct, the urge to protect her child. As she sat in her home office, surrounded by legal textbooks and case files, Shonda Vander Ark wasn't just living a double life. She was drafting a manual for a murder that she believed she could justify through the twisted logic of her own absolute rule. The architecture of the house on Millette Avenue was designed for a family of 4, but Shanda Vander Ark repurposed its layout into a tiered system of surveillance and subjugation. To the outside world, she was a high-achieving law clerk, but within the home, she acted as a grand architect of psychological conditioning. Her most successful project wasn't a legal brief. It was the total radicalization of her 20-year-old son, Paul Ferguson. Under Shanda's tutelage, the natural bond between siblings was systematically dismantled and replaced with a rigid military-style hierarchy of guard and prisoner. Paul was not merely a bystander in Timothy's suffering. He was groomed to be the primary enforcer. Shanda utilized her analytical mind to identify Paul's own psychological needs. specifically his desire for maternal approval and a sense of purpose, and redirected them toward the correction of his younger brother. She didn't just ask for his help. She drafted him into a war of attrition against a 15-year-old boy who lacked the cognitive capacity to understand why his world had turned to ice. The grooming was subtle at first, framed as a shared burden of managing a difficult child, but it quickly evolved into a dark, symbiotic relationship where the two adults bonded over the tactical execution of cruelty. The household operated under a regime of digital panopticon. Motion-activated cameras were installed throughout the home, including the unfinished basement where Timothy was eventually confined. These were not for security against the outside world. They were tools of internal management. Shonda would sit in her office or at her desk in the courthouse, monitoring the live feeds on her phone, sending a constant stream of text-based directives to Paul. The communication between them was clinical, devoid of parental warmth, and focused entirely on the subject's behavior. If Timothy moved too much, if he attempted to seek food, or if he showed signs of distress, the digital notification would trigger a response from the enforcer upstairs. Shanda managed Paul with the same cold precision she used on Timothy, but with the added incentive of inclusion. By involving him in the discipline, she made him a confidant. They spoke about Timothy in the third person, often using derogatory language that served to dehumanize the boy. This linguistic shift was a critical component of the manual. Once Timothy was no longer a brother or a son, but a problem to be solved, the threshold for violence vanished. Paul began to take pride in his role, reporting back to his mother with detailed logs of Timothy's failures, and seeking her advice on how to escalate the punishments when the previous ones failed to produce compliance. The discipline was never meant to be effective. It was meant to be absolute. Shanda convinced Paul that Timothy was faking his disabilities, that his struggles with autism and ADHD were actually sophisticated attempts at manipulation. This was the core lie of the household. It allowed Paul to view his brother's genuine suffering as a theatrical performance designed to annoy them. When Timothy cried out for water or bread, Paul was taught to see it as a test of his own resolve. To show mercy was to fail the mother. To be cruel was to be loyal. The physical environment reflected this mental shift. The common areas of the house remained respectable. The kitchen was stocked. The living room was tidy. But the basement was a sensory deprivation chamber. Under Shanda's instructions, Paul stripped the room of any comfort. No mattress. No blankets. Eventually, no clothing. Paul was tasked with ensuring Timothy remained in a stress position for hours on end, a tactic pulled directly from the dark history of interrogation manuals. If Timothy's posture faltered, Paul was there to correct him, often under the real-time observation of the cameras. As 2022 progressed, the dynamic between Shanda and Paul reached a fever pitch of shared obsession. They were no longer just a mother and son. They were a unit of two against one. The outside world, the law firm, the neighbors, the grocery store clerks, saw a woman and her grown son living a quiet suburban life. They couldn't hear the hum of the cameras or the silence of the boy in the basement. Shanda had successfully created a vacuum where her own rules were the only ones that mattered. She had turned Paul into a mirror of her own sociopathy, ensuring that even when she was physically absent, her manual was being followed to the letter. Paul Ferguson, once a brother, had been successfully bred into an accomplice, leaving Timothy Ferguson with no allies in the place he was supposed to call home. The clock at the Norton Shores Dispatch Center had not yet reached the peak of the morning rush when the call came in on July 6, 2022. Shanda Vander Ark spoke with a voice that was disturbingly level, a clinical, detached tone that lacked the frantic pitch usually associated with a parent finding their child breathless. She told the dispatcher that her 15-year-old son, Timothy, was unresponsive. He was cold to the touch. He wasn't breathing. In the background, there were no sounds of desperate resuscitation, no screams of grief. There was only the silence of a house that had already completed its grim transformation from a home into a laboratory of human suffering. When first responders arrived at the residence on Millett Avenue, they were greeted by the sight of a typical suburban dwelling, but the air inside told a different story. As they moved toward the basement, the professional veneer of the officers began to crack. They found Timothy Ferguson lying in a space that could not be called a bedroom. It was a sensory deprivation chamber, a concrete tomb where the only furniture was a thin, soiled tarp. The boy lying on that floor was unrecognizable as a teenager. At 15 years old, Timothy weighed exactly 69 pounds. His body was a map of extreme emaciation. His ribs stood out like the rafters of a ruined building, and his skin was pulled so tight over his joints that it seemed ready to tear. The officers noted that the boy was wearing nothing but a pair of thin shorts, despite the damp chill of the basement. His hands and feet were shriveled, the skin pruned and pale, a telltale sign of prolonged immersion in water. As paramedics confirmed what was already obvious, that Timothy had been dead for hours, Shonda stood nearby. She didn't reach for him. She didn't ask to hold his hand. Instead, she began to offer a practiced narrative, telling the investigators that Timothy had behavioral issues and had been refusing to eat for weeks. She spoke about him as if he were a faulty piece of equipment she had been trying to repair, rather than a child who had just perished under her roof. The search of the home that morning revealed the true nature of the law of the mother. In the basement, the detectives looked up and saw the unblinking eyes of the surveillance system. Motion-activated cameras were positioned to capture every inch of Timothy's confinement. There were sensors on the doors to alert the household if he tried to move, and alarms that triggered if he attempted to seek out the most basic human necessity, food. In the kitchen, they found a bottle of Carolina Reaper hot sauce, a substance so volatile it required gloves for handling, which Shanda later admitted was used to discipline Timothy by forcing it into his mouth or onto his sensitive skin. But the most damning evidence of the day's reckoning was found in the bathroom. A large plastic tub sat there, still partially filled with water that was registered at a temperature far below what the human body can endure for long. The investigation would soon reveal that Timothy's final hours were spent in this tub, a forced ice bath that lasted for over 9 hours. Shonda had directed Paul to keep the boy submerged in the freezing water as punishment for his lethargy. As Timothy's internal organs began to shut down from the onset of hypothermia, the cameras recorded his slow transition from struggle to silence. The forensic reality of July 6th was a paradox. Outside, the Michigan summer was in full swing, with temperatures climbing toward 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the house on Millet Avenue, Timothy Ferguson had frozen to death. The medical examiner would later note that the boy's stomach was entirely empty, his body fat percentage was non-existent, and his cause of death was a combination of malnutrition and acute hypothermia. He had been starved until his body had nothing left to burn for warmth, and then he was placed in the ice until the flame of his life was finally extinguished. Throughout the initial processing of the scene, Shonda and Paul moved through the house with a haunting sense of normalcy. While the detectives were reeling from the sight of the basement, Shonda was concerned with the logistics of her legal work. Paul, meanwhile, mirrored his mother's detachment, suggesting to the officers that Timothy's state was the result of his own stubbornness. They had lived in this echo chamber of cruelty for so long that they no longer recognized the horror of a 69-pound corpse in a basement. The day ended with the yellow tape being stretched across the front lawn, a visual scar on the quiet neighborhood. As the sun set on Millet Avenue, the community began to whisper, a low hum of confusion and growing dread. They had seen the successful law student and her helpful older son for months, never realizing that the silence coming from the house wasn't the silence of a peaceful home, but the muffled quiet of a boy who had been systematically erased. The reckoning had begun, and as the detectives secured the digital devices from the home, they realized that Timothy's death wasn't an accident or a sudden lapse in judgment. It was the final chapter of a manual that Shonda Vander Ark had been writing in blood and ice for years. The sirens eventually cut out, leaving the street in a heavy, unnatural silence. On Millet Avenue, the neighbors began to peer through their blinds, watching as the woman they knew as a quiet, ambitious law clerk was escorted to a patrol car. There was no struggle, no frantic display of emotion. She simply walked, her expression as flat and gray as the pavement under her feet. For those living just a few dozen feet away, The reality was impossible to reconcile with the image of the woman who spent her days working for a circuit court judge. They saw a professional, someone who understood the complexities of the legal system. Yet, the house she left behind was now being processed as a site of unthinkable tragedy. In the initial hours following Timothy's death, Shonda Vander Ark attempted to maintain the same clinical detachment that had characterized her career. Sitting in the interrogation room, she didn't present the image of a grieving mother. Instead, she offered the investigators a detailed, technical defense of her parenting protocol. She informed the detectives that the boy had long suffered from an eating disorder, claiming he would intentionally vomit or hide food to spite her. She spoke about his autism not as a vulnerability, but as a weapon he used to manipulate the household. According to her narrative, Timothy was the aggressor, a defiant teenager whose behavioral issues had pushed the family to their limits. She described a home life that was structured around correction. She admitted to the use of the ice baths, but framed them as a therapeutic necessity to reset Timothy's nervous system when he became overstimulated. She spoke about the motion-activated cameras as a safety measure, a way to ensure that a difficult child didn't harm himself in the middle of the night. Every horrific detail the police discovered was met with a legalistic justification. For Shonda, the fact that Timothy weighed only 69 pounds was not a sign of starvation, but a symptom of his own refusal to comply with the family's nutritional standards. She was, in her own mind, the victim of a child who had simply given up. Paul Ferguson, initially, mirrored this wall of silence. He sat in a separate room, repeating the phrases his mother had taught him. He spoke of Timothy's faking, how the boy would pretend to be weak to get out of his chores or his discipline. The two of them had lived in their shared delusion for so long that they believed their logic would hold up under the scrutiny of the law. They expected the detectives to see Timothy through their eyes, as a burden that had finally succumbed to its own inherent flaws. However, the walls of silence began to crumble the moment the case moved from the interrogation room to the morgue. Dr. Jared Emery, the medical examiner tasked with Timothy's autopsy, would later describe the findings as some of the most harrowing of his career. The physical evidence didn't just contradict Shonda's story, it obliterated it. The eating disorder narrative was disproven by the total lack of subcutaneous fat on the boy's body. Timothy hadn't just refused to eat. He had been systematically denied the calories necessary for survival. His body had quite literally begun to consume itself in a desperate search for fuel. The red flags were everywhere. The medical examiner noted the pruning of the skin on Timothy's hands and feet, which was far too severe to have been caused by a quick bath. It was the mark of someone who had been submerged in water for the better part of a day. There were signs of acute dehydration, despite the fact that the boy had been found in a house with running water. Perhaps most telling were the internal markers of hypothermia, the specific hemorrhaging in the stomach lining, and the state of the internal organs that suggested the body had been pushed far past the point of no return. As the medical reports were finalized, the narrative of natural causes or accidental death was officially discarded. This was no longer a welfare check gone wrong. It was a homicide investigation built on the foundation of a 15-year-old's emaciated frame. The police began to look closer at the household's digital footprint, realizing that while Shonda and Paul were talking to them, they had left behind a mountain of evidence that they hadn't realized was being recorded. The community's reaction shifted from confusion to a cold, simmering rage. Rumors began to circulate about what had really happened behind the closed doors of that respectable home. The brilliant mother was now being discussed in terms of monster and jailer. The local atmosphere in Norton Shores changed. The quiet pride of the neighborhood was replaced by a sense of collective guilt. How could a boy be starved to death in the middle of a suburb? Why hadn't anyone heard him? The silence of Milet Avenue wasn't just Shonda's creation anymore. It was a haunting reminder of how easily a child can disappear in plain sight when the world assumes that a woman of the law must surely be a woman of justice. The investigation was no longer about whether Timothy had died. It was about proving that his death was the intended outcome of a meticulously drafted manual of torture. And as the detectives prepared to dive into the thousands of text messages stored on the family's devices, they knew that Shanda Vander Ark's own words would eventually be the very things that ensured she would never see the outside of a prison cell again. The investigators didn't find the truth in Shanda's practice statements. They found it in the cold blue light of her cloud storage. When the forensic experts bypassed the encryption on the family's mobile devices, they didn't just find communication. They found a ledger of systematic eradication. It was a digital manual, a terrifying blueprint for the destruction of a human being, written in the shorthand of thousands of text messages. The sheer volume was staggering, thousands of interactions between a mother and her son that read more like an interrogation transcript than a family group chat. The digital trail revealed that Timothy's life wasn't taken in a moment of passion. It was dismantled, bite by bite, over the course of months. The language Shanda utilized in these messages was stripped of any maternal warmth, replaced by a clinical, almost bureaucratic detachment. She didn't refer to Timothy by his name. She spoke of him in the third person as the subject, the problem, or simply it. Her legal training had allowed her to compartmentalize her cruelty into a series of actionable protocols, a term she used frequently to give her sociopathy a veneer of professional structure. In her mind, she wasn't torturing a child, she was managing a non-compliant entity. Every act of perceived defiance, no matter how small, was met with a text-based directive for Paul to execute a specific predetermined punishment. The motion-activated cameras provided the visual evidence for Shanda's private, internal courtroom. Every time Timothy shifted on the cold basement floor, every time his emaciated frame sought a moment of relief from the concrete, a notification would chime on Shanda's phone. Whether she was sitting in a high-stakes meeting or preparing a legal brief for the court, she was never more than a tap away from a live feed of her son's suffering. She would watch him from her desk and then instantly text Paul with instructions on how to correct his posture or reset his focus. It was a 24-hour cycle of surveillance that ensured Timothy was never truly alone, yet was more isolated than a prisoner in solitary confinement. The manual also detailed the horrific Spice Protocol. The text logs revealed a meticulous plan to use Carolina Reaper hot sauce not as a condiment, but as a chemical weapon. Shanda didn't just tell Paul to use it. She discussed the optimal delivery methods and the required concentration to ensure maximum distress. She would text Paul to ask if the boy was reacting appropriately, or if they needed to increase the dosage to break his spirit. They spoke about the searing pain of the sauce with the casualness of people discussing a weekend recipe, even as the substance caused Timothy's mouth and throat to blister and raw. The digital investigation also uncovered the chilling architecture of the ice baths. Through the timestamps of the messages, detectives tracked the escalation of the submersion from a few minutes of cooling off to grueling multi-hour ordeals. Shanda would ask for status reports on the water temperature and Timothy's physical state, asking if his lips were blue yet or if he was still putting on a show of shivering. When Paul reported that the boy was losing the ability to speak or stand, Shanda's response was never to offer heat. She would tell Paul to keep him in until he reached a state of total compliance. In her twisted logic, the creeping onset of hypothermia was merely a tool for behavioral cleansing. Beyond the physical torture, the manual outlined a sophisticated regime of sleep deprivation and nutritional warfare. Shanda and Paul coordinated shifts through their phones to ensure Timothy remained awake for days on end. The manual specified that he was to stand in stress positions, facing a basement wall, hands at his sides, for hours without moving. If the camera showed his head nodding, a text was sent, and Paul was alerted to intervene. The digital record showed a mother who viewed her son's biological need for rest as a personal affront to her authority. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the denial log. It wasn't a record of what Timothy ate, but a detailed account of what was withheld. Shanda would text Paul to confirm that the boy had received nothing but water for 48 hours. She would then instruct him to withhold even the reward of dry bread if his behavior didn't meet her shifting standards. While Timothy's body was quite literally consuming its own muscle tissue in the darkness of the basement, Shonda and Paul were sharing photos of their own meals, mocking the boys' hunger in a private digital echo chamber of callousness. The detectives realized that Shonda had documented her own crimes with the precision of a professional who believed she was untouchable. She thought that by framing her cruelty as parenting, she could bypass the very legal system she served. She didn't realize that every send button she pressed was another nail in the coffin of her defense. The manual she wrote for Paul would eventually become the prosecution's most powerful weapon, a self-authored confession that transformed the high-achieving law clerk into the primary witness for her own condemnation. The courtroom drama of late 2023 was as cold and unrelenting as the concrete floor Timothy had died upon. Shonda Vander Ark, the once composed law clerk, watched her defense disintegrate under the weight of her own digital archive. A visceral moment occurred that shocked the gallery when the prosecution displayed forensic images of Timothy's 69-pound frame. Shonda physically buckled, vomiting into a bin and nearly losing consciousness. It was a stark biological reaction from a woman who had spent a year ignoring the physical agony of her own child. Paul Ferguson eventually took the stand against her, his testimony acting as the final damning gear in the machinery of justice. He detailed the protocol and the grooming that had turned a brother into a jailer. In January 2024, Judge Matthew Casel delivered a scathing rebuke, labeling her actions as absolute torture. Shonda was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a final, permanent verdict for the woman who believed she was above the law. The house on Milet Avenue stands silent, a monument to a justice system that eventually turned its gaze inward. Shonda Vander Ark's manual was meant to be her masterwork of control. Instead, it became the blueprint for her own destruction. As she sits within the concrete walls she once prescribed for her son, the memory of Timothy Ferguson remains, a 69-pound ghost who forced a quiet town to wake up. The law of the land proved stronger than the law of the mother, and Timothy finally has his peace. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. The silence in Sullivan County was absolute, until it wasn't. In February 2020, authorities realized 15-month-old Evelyn Mae Boswell had vanished, not hours ago, but 2 full months prior. While a community scrambled through the Tennessee brush, the mother, Megan Boswell, sat in an interrogation room, spinning a web of contradictions so dense it felt physical. She spoke of kidnappings, secret handoffs, and silver BMWs, all while the truth lay chillingly close to home. This is the story of a search for a ghost, and the mother who manufactured the haunting. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Sullivan County, Tennessee is a place defined by its contrasts. It's nestled in the northeastern corner of the state, where the Appalachian foothills roll into horizons of deep green and smoky blue. To a passerby, the towns of Blountville and Kingsport feel like the quintessential American heartland. Church steeples, local diners, and the quiet dignity of a region built on manufacturing and retail. But beneath that scenic veneer, the county grappled with the same quiet desperation seen across much of rural America. In the years leading up to the tragedy, the median individual income sat at just over $33,000, and for many families, the line between stability and crisis was thinner than a mountain mist. This was the world that shaped Megan Boswell. Born around the turn of the millennium, Megan's early years were not a story of stability. She was the product of a family dynamic that law enforcement would later describe as toxic and fractured. Her mother, Angela Boswell, would eventually stand before a judge and admit that she had failed her daughter in every way that mattered. Angela was a woman whose own life was a map of legal troubles and personal failures, leaving little room for the nurturing Megan needed. In the courtrooms of Sullivan County, the history of the Boswell home was laid bare, a cycle of neglect that seemed to pass from one generation to the next, like an inheritance. By the time Megan was 17, she was a ghost in the system. Her social worker, Gail Kite, would later describe the girl she met during those years as a teenager who was not just neglected, but actively traumatized. Megan arrived in the system malnourished and terrified, carrying the heavy weight of past abuse that no child should ever have to understand. She was a girl who had spent time in foster care, adrift in a world that hadn't provided her with a single solid anchor. Yet, even in the midst of that chaos, there were flashes of a different future. While in foster care, Megan managed to earn her high school diploma, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she might break the cycle that had defined her mother's life. Then came the pregnancy. In late 2018, 17-year-old Megan was preparing to bring a new life into her already cluttered world. The father was Ethan Perry, a young man who would eventually join the army and find himself stationed far away in Louisiana. At the time, those close to Megan said she seemed genuinely excited. There was a hope, perhaps a naive one, that a child would provide the purpose and unconditional love she had missed throughout her own upbringing. On November 21st, 2018, Evelyn Mae Boswell was born. She was a bright-eyed baby, a tiny spark of light in a family that had known far too much darkness. But the reality of motherhood in Sullivan County was a far cry from the trial visits Megan had experienced during her time in the system. The infrastructure of her life was built on sand. She didn't have a home of her own. Instead, she and the infant were part of a nomadic existence, shifting between the homes of relatives, temporary motels, and the crowded spaces shared with her mother, Angela. The relationship between mother and daughter remained a powder keg. Angela later testified that she hadn't been a good role model, and the friction between them grew as Megan struggled with the demands of a toddler while trying to navigate her own late adolescence. There were warning signs, though they were easily missed in a region where families often move in the shadows of the economy. Megan began skipping pediatrician appointments. The excited mother who had once talked about a fresh start was being replaced by someone more guarded, someone who was learning that if you tell enough stories, you can hide the cracks in your life. Her father, Tommy Boswell Sr., would eventually recount how the lies started small before they became the very air Megan breathed. He described a daughter who didn't know how to tell the truth, a girl who had become a master at manipulation simply to survive the volatility of her own household. As 2019 drew to a close, the scenery of Sullivan County began to change. The lush greens of the Appalachians turned to the skeletal grays and browns of winter. Inside the various trailers and rooms where the Boswells stayed, the atmosphere was growing cold in a different way. The bond between Megan and the world around her was fraying. People stopped seeing Evelyn. They didn't ask at first. Life is busy, and in Megan's world, people often came and went without much explanation. But the silence surrounding the 15-month-old girl was beginning to solidify into something heavy, something permanent. The stage was being set for a deception that would not just lie to a family, but to an entire state. The air in Blountville during those months carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a sensory backdrop to a life that was increasingly isolated. Megan was no longer the scared girl her social worker remembered. She was evolving. To those she met in passing, she appeared like any other young mother, perhaps a bit overwhelmed, perhaps a bit distant. But behind her eyes, a strategic engine was running. She was learning to compartmentalize her reality, separating the child who needed her from the life she wanted to lead, a life free from the suffocating weight of responsibility. In the small, cramped spaces of their temporary dwellings, the presence of Evelyn Mae was becoming an inconvenience to the narrative Megan was building for herself. The endless lies weren't just a habit, they were a fortress, and inside that fortress, the fate of a 15-month-old was already being sealed by the very person who was supposed to be her protector. If Megan Boswell was the architect of a fractured reality, the ground she built it on was the Muddy Creek property in Blountville, a landscape defined by deferred maintenance and family secrets. Dominating this space was a brown shed, a former playhouse where the echoes of childhood laughter had long since been replaced by a grim, utilitarian silence. This was the family's home base, but it lacked the permanence the name implied. As Megan shifted between trailers and the homes of various boyfriends, the instability became a constant weight on her child. Her father, Tommy Boswell Sr., watched as his daughter's life became a series of escalating deceptions, once describing her as a master manipulator who could no longer distinguish her fabrications from the truth. He later testified about the friction that defined their cohabitation, specifically how a simple disagreement over a messy bedroom could escalate into a conflict so sharp it forced Megan to move out. It wasn't just typical teenage rebellion. It was the visible fraying of a support system that Evelyn May was supposed to depend on. The shadow of Angela Boswell loomed over every room. Her criminal record wasn't just a list of mistakes, it was a way of life that Megan observed from the front row. In early 2020, even as the search for Evelyn was beginning to reach a fever pitch, Angela was being arrested alongside her boyfriend, William McLeod, in Tannersville, Virginia, for their involvement in an aggravated burglary and the theft of a gray BMW. This environment was one where legal authorities were seen as adversaries rather than protectors. Angela's admission that she witnessed and participated in drug use, opiates specifically, within the home, provided the gritty context for Megan's own developmental trajectory. There were no guardrails in this family, only the chaotic momentum of people trying to outrun their own reputations. Angela later admitted to the court that she had been a hollow role model, failing her daughter in the most fundamental ways imaginable. She acknowledged that the tumultuous household, filled with arguments and fighting, was the only world Megan ever really knew. Into this vacuum of stability stepped Ethan Perry. For a long time, he was the man Megan pointed to as the father, the soldier stationed at an army base in Louisiana who was supposedly caring for the child. But as investigators began to pull at the threads of Megan's story, the image of the military father began to dissolve. Ethan cooperated fully, providing a stark contrast to the Boswell family's defensive posture, and the truth was eventually laid bare. It was determined that Perry was not Evelyn's biological father at all. The relationship had been a series of arguments about paternity and threats, a toxic connection that left Megan feeling worn out and ready for someone else to step up. She portrayed herself as a mother under siege, yet those who caught a glimpse of life inside her world saw a far more disturbing reality. Visitors to the home didn't see the perfect mother Megan tried to project online. They saw a 15-month-old girl living in squalor. A babysitter named Sue later described the visceral experience of caring for Evelyn, how the child often smelled so strongly of urine that she had to be immediately bathed and scrubbed clean just to make the air in the room breathable. Other friends recalled eating out with Megan and the baby, noting that the stench coming from Evelyn was detectable from across the table, a silent plea for care that was being ignored. Even Megan's own descriptions of her daughter were laced with a strange detached hostility. She reportedly called the toddler mean as Shotty to acquaintances, painting a picture of a child who was more of a burden than a blessing. The neglect was sensory. It wasn't just the memory box filled with baby bottles found in the white shed. It was the way Evelyn existed in the minds of those who saw her. To Megan's friend Caitlin Carter, the toddler was a source of embarrassment, a child so physically neglected that her presence was marked by a lingering smell that ruined a simple meal out. To Erica Stacy, the mother of another of Megan's romantic interests, the child was an obstacle, a complication that kept Megan from fully immersing herself in her new life with a man named Hunter Woods. While Megan and Hunter were posing for photos at an aquarium in 2019, Evelyn was being treated as a secondary character in a story that Megan was rewriting daily. The chaos of the Boswell family wasn't an accident. It was a cultivated atmosphere of dysfunction where a 15-month-old girl was slowly becoming invisible, hidden behind a mountain of unpaid debts, stolen cars, and the persistent, nauseating smell of urine that no one seemed bothered enough to wash away. December in Sullivan County isn't the glistening postcard winter of the North. It's a season of damp, bone-chilling gray. The vibrant oranges and reds of the Appalachian autumn had long since rotted into a slick, brown sludge on the forest floor by 2019. In the small wood-heated trailers and drafty homes of Blountville, families were huddling toward the holidays, hanging string lights and planning meals. But for 15-month-old Evelyn May Boswell, the light was about to go out. The second week of December marked the transition from a child's existence to a ghost's legend, a transition orchestrated by the mother who had already begun to treat her daughter as a footnote in a new, more exciting story. The last verified sighting of Evelyn May occurred around December 10th or 11th. At that point, the toddler was still alive, still breathing the cold Tennessee air. She was seen by a babysitter, a woman who remembered the child's bright eyes and the persistent, neglected state of her clothes. But after that day, the physical presence of Evelyn evaporated from the public eye. She didn't just disappear, she was systematically erased. As the calendar turned toward Christmas, Megan Boswell didn't show the signs of a mother whose child had been snatched or lost. There was no frantic pacing, no tearful phone calls to the sheriff's office, no desperate posts on community Facebook pages. Instead, Megan leaned into the silence. She occupied herself with the mundane details of a young woman's social life, flirting, posting, and searching for the next spark of validation. While the rest of the world was wrapping gifts, Megan was wrapping herself in a new romance. She had started seeing a man named Hunter Woods, and to those who watched her during those weeks, she seemed lighter, almost unburdened. She spent her days and nights at his place, or driving around the county, playing the role of the carefree girlfriend. When friends or family members asked where the baby was, Megan had an answer ready for every occasion, a different answer for every person. To some, she said Evelyn was with her biological father, Ethan Perry. To others, she claimed the child was staying with her grandmother, Angela. She spoke with such casual confidence that no one thought to double-check. In a family culture where people frequently drifted in and out of each other's lives, the baby is with a relative excuse was the ultimate conversation stopper. The psychological chilling of Megan Boswell was most evident on social media. While Evelyn was missing, or perhaps already dead, Megan was active on TikTok and Facebook. She posted videos of herself smiling, lip-syncing to songs about heartbreak and resilience, and posing for selfies that emphasized her dark hair and wide, practiced smile. There is a specific kind of horror in seeing those timestamps, realizing that while a toddler's life had been cut short, her mother was meticulously choosing filters for a video. She even took a trip to an aquarium in Gatlinburg with Hunter during this period. They walked through the glass tunnels, watching sharks and rays glide overhead in the blue water. While back in Sullivan County, the real world was becoming increasingly cold and final. Witnesses later remembered that she didn't seem distracted or mourning. She seemed like a girl on a first date, eager to please and entirely present in the moment. The Christmas of 2019 passed in Sullivan County without a single present for Evelyn May. There was no tree with her name under it, no photos of her opening a toy, no holiday meal where she sat in a high chair. Megan's father, Tommy Sr., later recalled the hollowness of that season. He had seen Megan, but he hadn't seen his granddaughter. He had asked about her, but the answers remained vague. Evelyn was taken care of, or she was at the other house. The family dynamic, already strained by decades of conflict and distrust, allowed this vacuum to exist. No one wanted to start a fight on Christmas Day. No one wanted to be the one to accuse Megan of lying when she looked them in the eye and promised the baby was safe. So the holiday lights twinkled in Blountville, and the town sang carols, while the silence surrounding the 15-month-old grew deeper and more suffocating. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, the silence of December had become a permanent fixture of the Boswell household. Megan had managed to go 20 days without her daughter, and the world hadn't ended. She had discovered that if you lie with enough conviction, people will eventually stop asking questions because the truth is too exhausting to pursue. She was living in a bubble of her own making, a world where Evelyn didn't need to be fed or changed or comforted. She told Hunter Woods that she was embroiled in a messy custody battle to explain the child's absence, painting herself as the victim of a vindictive ex-husband and a broken legal system. It was a brilliant, tactical move. It turned her child's disappearance into a source of sympathy for her new boyfriend. But beneath the surface of the social media posts and the aquarium dates, the physical reality was lurking. The brown shed on the Muddy Creek property sat in the winter dark, a silent witness to whatever had transpired in those middle weeks of December. The ground was hard, frozen solid by the Tennessee frosts. There were no search parties yet, no yellow tape. There was only the sound of the wind whipping through the bare branches of the trees and the muffled sounds of the highway in the distance. Megan Boswell had successfully navigated the most difficult month of the year. She had survived the holidays without a child, and as far as she was concerned, she had gotten away with it. The transition was complete. Evelyn Mae Boswell was no longer a toddler requiring care. She had been relegated to a problem that Megan had solved through the sheer force of her own deception. As 2020 dawned, the residents of Sullivan County went back to work, unaware that they were living next to a ticking clock. The lies Megan had told in December were beginning to overlap and fray at the edges. You can only tell a grandfather his granddaughter is fine so many times before he demands to hear her voice. You can only tell a boyfriend about a custody battle for so long before he asks to see a lawyer's letter. The pressure was building, but Megan remained calm, almost eerily so. She had spent the last 30 days practicing her craft, refining her stories until they felt like skin. She was ready for January. She was ready for the questions. Or so she thought. In the shadows of the Appalachian foothills, the truth wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the thaw. The timeline of a typical missing persons case is measured in heartbeats, the frantic minutes after a child wanders away, or the agonizing hours when a teenager fails to return home by curfew. But in Sullivan County, the clock didn't start until the batteries were already dead. On February 18th, 2020, the Tennessee Department of Children's Services contacted the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office with a request that felt like a punch to the gut. They needed to conduct a welfare check on 15-month-old Evelyn Mae Boswell, a child who, by all accounts, had not been seen by anyone outside her immediate, secretive circle for nearly 2 months. It was a 57-day void that defied every protocol of modern law enforcement. The official report didn't come from Megan. It was triggered by other family members who could no longer stomach the shifting stories and the empty high chair. Tommy Boswell Sr. finally spoke to authorities, admitting that the last time he had laid eyes on his granddaughter was back in November or very early December. When the sheriff's office sat Megan down for the first of what would become dozens of interviews, she didn't react with the desperation of a grieving mother. She reacted with the calculation of a cornered animal. She told the investigators she had been under pressure and claimed that the child was safe, yet she was unable to provide a single address, a single phone number, or a single shred of physical proof that Evelyn was drawing breath. By the evening of February 19th, the Amber Alert was officially issued. It was a digital scream that echoed across every smartphone from Bristol to Memphis. The photo of Evelyn Mae, blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a wide, innocent smile, became the most recognized face in the state. But as the public began to share the alert, the grim reality of the delay started to settle in like a cold fog over the Tennessee Valley. Most Amber Alerts are issued within hours of a disappearance. This one was issued while the child's trail was already 60 days cold. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, and the FBI joined the search, deploying agents to comb through the dense brush and rolling hills of Blountville. But they were searching for a needle in a haystack that had been scattered by 2 months of winter wind. The community's response was a tidal wave of localized fury and desperate hope. Hundreds of volunteers descended on the region, their boots caked in the orange clay mud of East Tennessee. They searched the edges of Boone Lake and the deep ravines near the Muddy Creek property. The air was filled with the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors and the baying of cadaver dogs. Yet, as the searchers tore through the woods, Megan Boswell was frequently spotted at local convenience stores and driving through town, seemingly detached from the chaos she had initiated. She told reporters that she knew exactly who had her daughter, but she claimed she couldn't say their names because she was scared for her life. It was a narrative designed to make her the protagonist of a thriller rather than the suspect in a tragedy. The frustration within the sheriff's office was palpable. Every time they chased a lead, it ended in a brick wall or a graveyard. Megan pointed them toward a silver BMW, claiming the child had been handed over to people in that car, leading to a multi-state search for a vehicle that may never have existed in the context of a kidnapping. She gave the names of people who were later found to be incarcerated or out of the state at the time of the alleged handoff. To the detectives, it felt like they were trying to build a bridge out of smoke. Every word Megan spoke required a 48-hour investigation to disprove, effectively stalling the search and wasting thousands of man-hours. Social media became a battlefield. The Justice for Evelyn groups swelled with thousands of members who analyzed every pixel of Megan's past TikToks and Facebook posts. Rumors swirled like a cyclone through the county. Stories of child trafficking, of secret adoptions, of family blood feuds. The local atmosphere shifted from communal grief to a paranoid, finger-pointing rage. People began to look at the Boswell family property on Muddy Creek Road with a sense of visceral dread. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a crime scene in waiting. As the first week of the Amber Alert drew to a close, the search efforts began to narrow. The TBI issued a statement expressing their deep frustration with the conflicting information provided by the mother. They weren't just searching for Evelyn, they were fighting a psychological war with Megan. The sensory experience of that week in Blountville was one of exhaustion. The smell of damp earth being overturned by shovels, the blinding glare of police floodlights at night, and the oppressive silence that followed every failed lead. The Amber Alert had come too late to prevent whatever had happened in December. And as the investigators looked back at the mother who had waited 2 months to report her child missing, they realized they weren't looking for a kidnapper. They were looking for a burial site. The paradox of the case sat heavy in the gut of every Sullivan County resident. How does a child vanish for 60 days in a world of constant connection? Megan Boswell had managed to keep the world at bay with a smile and a shrug until the weight of the lie became too great for the family to carry. And while the state of Tennessee prayed for a miracle, the veteran detectives on the case began to prepare for the inevitable. They knew that in the world of missing children, time is the only currency that matters, and Megan Boswell had spent every second they had. The interrogation room at the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office was a sterile, windowless box that smelled of industrial floor wax and the low-voltage hum of fluorescent lights. Inside, Megan Boswell sat with a composure that chilled the veteran investigators across the table. For most parents, the realization that their child had been missing for weeks would be a catalyst for a psychological collapse. For Megan, it was a stage. Over the next several days, she would construct what the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation eventually categorized as 19 different versions of the truth, a labyrinth of deceit designed to lead law enforcement into a multi-state wilderness of dead ends and red herrings. The first lie was perhaps the most tactical. Megan told the detectives that she had handed Evelyn over to a woman in a silver BMW in the parking lot of a local Piggly Wiggly. She provided a vivid description of the transaction, claiming the woman was part of a safe house network meant to protect the child from the Tennessee Department of Children's Services. This lie was calculated. It capitalized on the deep-seated distrust of government agencies common in rural Appalachia and gave the police a tangible, moving target. Sullivan County deputies and TBI agents spent hundreds of man-hours scouring surveillance footage from every gas station and grocery store in the Tri-Cities area. They looked for a silver BMW that never appeared. They looked for a woman who didn't exist. When the BMW story began to fray under the weight of digital evidence, Megan didn't retract it. She simply layered a new fiction on top. She shifted the focus to her mother, Angela Boswell. She told the investigators that her mother had taken the child to a remote cabin in Virginia, claiming that Angela was the true architect of the disappearance. This sent authorities across the state line into the rugged terrain of Scott County and beyond. At the time, Angela was already a person of interest in a vehicle theft, which made the lie plausible enough to waste another 48 hours of critical search time. While the police were knocking on doors in the Virginia mountains, Megan was back in Sullivan County, calmly asking for updates on the search she was actively sabotaging. The 19 shades of deceit weren't just random fabrications, they were defensive maneuvers. Every time a detective pointed out a flaw in her logic, like the fact that the person she claimed had the child was actually in jail, Megan would pause, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for the next chapter. She told one officer that a man she met online had snatched the child during a secret meeting. Then, she claimed Evelyn had been taken by a family friend whose name she suddenly couldn't remember. She even attempted to paint a picture of a sophisticated kidnapping ring, suggesting she was being blackmailed by powerful people. The lead investigators, including Sheriff Jeff Cassidy, later remarked that interviewing Megan was like trying to walk through a swamp. Every step forward only led to sinking deeper into her manufactured reality. The most manipulative of her lies involved a claim of pregnancy. During her initial period of detention for false reporting, Megan told jailers and investigators that she was 7 weeks pregnant. It was a transparent attempt to garner sympathy and perhaps secure a lower bond or better treatment within the facility. She leaned into the role, describing her symptoms and expressing concern for her unborn child, while the state was still trying to find her actual, living 15-month-old daughter. A subsequent medical examination proved she was lying, but for a period of several days, the media and the public were forced to grapple with the image of a pregnant mother under siege, exactly as Megan intended. One of the most physically exhausting red herrings came when Megan claimed she would lead police to a specific location in a local park where the child was being kept. She spoke of a hidden path and a specific landmark. The authorities, desperate for any breakthrough, mobilized a massive contingent of officers and search dogs. They followed her directions through the damp, cold Tennessee woods, only to find that the landmark was a generic tree and the path led to a dead end. She stood there, wrapped in a police-issued jacket, looking at the frustrated searchers with a blank expression, eventually claiming she must have confused the locations because of the stress. It was a calculated display of power. She was showing the authorities that she, and she alone, controlled the tempo of the investigation. The TBI eventually issued a public statement that was uncharacteristically blunt. They told the citizens of Tennessee that every single lead provided by Megan Boswell had been disproven through forensic analysis and traditional detective work. The authorities were no longer just looking for a child. They were fighting a war of attrition against a pathological liar who viewed the search for her daughter as a game of chess. Each lie served to distance the investigators from the Muddy Creek property, the Brown Shed, and the physical evidence that was slowly being recovered. The psychological toll on the investigators was immense. Sheriff Jeff Cassidy, a man who had seen decades of crime in Sullivan County, appeared at press conferences with a visible tremor of suppressed anger in his voice. He told the media that he was tired of being lied to. He was tired of the games. And he was tired of a mother who didn't care enough to tell the truth about where her baby was. The community's sympathy for Megan had long since evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp demand for justice. The mother of endless lies had successfully stalled the legal system for weeks, but the walls of her labyrinth were closing in. While she was busy weaving her 20th version of the truth, the forensic teams were heading back to the one place she had tried so hard to make them ignore: the family farm. The investigation into these 19 versions of the truth would eventually form the backbone of the prosecution's case. It proved premeditation, it proved a conscious effort to conceal a crime, and most importantly, it proved a total lack of remorse. Megan Boswell hadn't just lied to the police, she had lied to a grieving nation, using the image of her innocent daughter as a shield to protect herself from the inevitable. As the final weeks of February 2020 bled into March, the air in Sullivan County grew heavy with the realization that the lies were the only thing Megan had left. The 19 shades of deceit had finally run their course, and the truth was about to be unearthed from the red Tennessee clay. On March 6, 2020, the search of the Muddy Creek property reached its grim conclusion. In the shadows of that brown shed, the same structure Megan had once played in as a child, investigators uncovered a plastic trash can. Inside, they found the remains of Evelyn May, wrapped in trash bags and discarded amidst the clutter of the family's past. The forensic reality shattered Megan's remaining facade. She later attempted to claim the death was a tragic accident during sleep, but her actions, the 2-month silence, and the burial in a shed, spoke of a far more sinister intent. In February 2023, the legal system delivered its final word. Megan Boswell was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of her daughter. The woman who had manufactured 19 shades of deceit was finally cornered by the truth. As she was led away in shackles, the endless lies finally stopped. But for the people of Sullivan County, the silence of Evelyn May would echo forever. Sullivan County still carries the weight of those 2 months, a period where a child was missing and nobody noticed. The brown shed on Muddy Creek Road stands as a grim monument to maternal betrayal, a place where the endless lies finally met their end. Megan Boswell will grow old in a cell, but no amount of time can restore the life of a 15-month-old girl tossed away like trash. The search is over. The trial is finished. But in the quiet of Blountville, the name Evelyn May still echoes, a whisper of what should have been. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.